Bienvenidos y comenzamos.
Good afternoon and welcome to the three-day sustainability event. We are going to end the event talking about governance and risk management. Let me be a journalist for a moment, if I could. If you've had lunch today, lots of things have happened. Liz Truss has resigned. You probably have already heard that piece of news. And maybe something else relevant for this particular event is that there has been an announcement that France, Spain and Portugal will be coming up with a new agreement. It's all been signed for the new mid-cap. The old one has been pushed aside, but there'll be a new one. But we'll be hearing about Marseille to Barcelona. A new green hydrogen and gas corridor is going to be set up. And gas, by the way, I did say gas. So President Macron, the Costa from Portugal and Sanchez from Spain have just announced that agreement. We'll be able to talk about all of that later as we go through long-term sustainability issues that we'll be delving into. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions too about this last-minute news that I've just announced to you. I'm pretty sure someone's going to ask one of the speakers about that. So we're going to look at the two sides of this story, short-term vision, and we're going to look ahead in the long term. You know that during the afternoon, we'll be hearing from the key players in the industry. We'll be hearing from the regulators in the industry. The governor of the Bank of Spain will be speaking this afternoon. So we will be working our way through the two different dimensions, short-term, the Ukrainian war, inflation, sustainability, and we'll also take a look further ahead to the long term. Let me, if I could, welcome all of you following us online through the website that we have set up for the streaming of this event on Twitter and YouTube. Welcome to all of you following us online, and thank you for joining us. And if I could, I'd like to start off by speaking as a bit of a groupie today. This very first panel session is really well worth a listen to. Let me say again, it's always a bit embarrassing, isn't it? It's a bit like feeling like a teenager to say you admire somebody who's with you. But I do admire this person, Adela Cortina, who is the chair of Ethics and Philosophy. We'll be speaking to Enric Juliana from La Vanguardia newspaper, and they're going to be talking about ethical and civic sustainability. Welcome to both of you, and when you're ready, come up to the stage.
Como me conozco a uno de los...
And I know one of you, and so I'm warning you, 25 minutes, that's all you've got. I won't say who it is that I know. Enric Juliana, when you're ready, go ahead. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come here. You're right, there's lots of big news today, and I'm a journalist myself. So to talk about general issues instead of sticking to the concrete specific news is hard, because my temptation is to say to Adela Cortina, what do you think about what's going on in Europe, what's happened today, and what impact will it all have on things in the world, the broader world? But I won't start off on that note. But it might be interesting to kick off this discussion talking about the current times, because the Germans call it the spirit of time. And if you have been tracking what has been worrying us most for the last 2 years or more than that now, then you've realized that we're living basically in the midst of uncertainty since 2020. It's been really acute uncertainty that we've been living in a state of anxiety because of the pandemic. We've been worried about the limits and possibilities of science, and also we've had this problem with our trust or confidence in science, haven't we? And now, with almost no spare time in the middle, things have just linked up together. And now what worries us is the understanding of the world, things that are happening, why are they happening? And it seems almost unbelievable that the things we're told are happening. If I could start on that note, I think maybe the 23 minutes that we've got left will be taken up by that. Well, first of all, before I answer your question, thank you so much for asking me to come up on the stage and talk to such a wonderful person, Juliana. And your question, then, I think it's so interesting. You yourself started off talking about the sidecast, that spirit of time that Germans talk about. During the pandemic, we realized that as soon as we heard about vaccines and that the whole problem could be resolved because science was inventing vaccines, I think stock market started to soar again. People started to feel joyous again, and certainly technology and science have to be really fully taken advantage of. But who's behind technology and of course, science, because we've heard that the European Union will solve the problem of vaccines. It won't be individual countries. We heard that, didn't we? We said, that's great. We all have to do this together. Cooperation is what binds us together as human beings. And then after that, we said, okay, cooperation. Where does that end? Only in the EU? What will happen with Latin America and Africa? What about them as well? And we realized that things go far beyond our borders. So science and technology matter depending on which side we're on here. And I think all of us want things to actually work for themselves at home, but I believe in ethics. I'm a professor, a chair of ethics, and I'm not earning more by saying that. I'm an emeritus professor, by the way. But who is pulling on the reins of technology and science, and which direction are they pulling them in? And at the time, I think we realized we were being very selfish, weren't we? Because we needed vaccination for everybody because we were all in the same boat. And we felt if we don't vaccinate everybody, then this will be disaster. So yes, that is true. We should have been thinking that vaccines should have been available for one and all, for all of us as human beings. So technology, science, ethics have to be interlinked. We need to put them together. We all need to feel that we are citizens of the same world, and that's the long-term view. Let me go to that second question then. Dilemmas. The dilemmas we have today are even more complex than that. Because in principle, we're all pro-peace, aren't we? I don't think there's anybody out there, even those who had dreamt up this war, would not say that they are actually pro-peace. But what happens? What's your ethical attitude? What positions you take when one country invades another, and the treaties that have been signed are torn up, and those patterns that have set out the order in the world since the Second World War are also torn up. How do you see the war in Ukraine? Well, how do I see that? On this point, the European Union has taken up a position which I agree with totally. In principle, I think we have to stand by the underdog, the country that has been attacked, and that's Ukraine. We have to support all of those who are being attacked. We have to support those who are humiliated and offended, if I can quote. There have been sanctions that have been imposed. We have to support that. We have to provide weapons so they can fight. I think we need to continue to do those things. And on top of that, we have to take this right to the end of the road until the point when Putin has to surrender. Let me use that word quite clearly. When some sort of negotiations have to take place and some agreement has to be made, which should not harm and prejudiced the Ukrainians. They shouldn't have anything taken away from them, and they should also be compensated for the damage and harm that's been caused to them. That is the direction I think things should move in, because if we are to build peace, we have to build it always on the foundations of justice. There can be no long-lasting, credible peace that unless it's built on justice. I wrote an article that was entitled "Negotiation under Torture." And what I meant was that you can't blackmail somebody saying, either you agree with this or I will launch nuclear missiles. You can't do that. If somebody is being forced to confess because they're being tortured, then that information is really worthless. We have to attain a fair, a just peace. That's my position. And we have to build peace in the long term. And that's the cosmopolitan view. But in the short term, that's the view I have on Ukraine. I'd also like to throw out another question to you. Here we are in this event run by this energy company, and the people here, what they do is provide energy to Spain, and also it goes abroad. There is one very big, important country in Europe in economic and political and strategic terms, and that is Germany. Historically, of course, Germany had to pull through what it had to pull through, and it signed a major energy agreement with Russia, and we could almost have seen with hindsight that there was a philosophical concept that was underlying that. It was all about long-lasting peace. If we sign a good energy agreement with Russia, we won't only be able to buy energy at a cheap price, but we will re-establish those lines of contact with Russia that will strike the right balance for the future. It's almost a Kantian view, isn't it? If I could say that. So everything will be balanced, and we will be part of that balance. And with Nord Stream, you have that monument that was built to this idea. And this is absolutely real, and we've seen it in running through the seabed. So the issues raised by this: one, should we criticize the Germans for having been absolutely naive, thinking that they could actually attain long-lasting peace in this way? That's the first question. Two, should we be afraid of more destabilization going beyond politics? Will Germany be destabilized in the future by this? Well, first and foremost, I have to say that Germany is in a very uncomfortable position, as we all know, because of everything that happened back in time with the Second World War. They were left completely undefended. They couldn't have weapons, could they? They weren't allowed to have those arms to equip themselves there because of a new war. And so we in a way, are happy about what is happening now, because they can't be left defenseless like that. Then that was a big step forward with that tripartite agreement with the Greens that were very sensible, and they thought. And going back to the Kantian perpetual long-lasting peace that you were talking about, it's all about getting rid of the causes that could actually provoke a war. Get rid of wars and get rid of the causes that could lead to a war. Otherwise, we're always going to be in a state of war. And perhaps they could have been naive when they signed that gas agreement. Anyone could be naive. You might be naive thinking that there will be trust and confidence, but when all of that changes, well, you realize that was a mistake, and you have to correct that mistake somehow. As Kant said in the Metaphysics of Customs about perpetual peace, what you have to do is try to democratize every single one of the nations in the world. So this democratization can be rolled out across the world until we end up being a full cosmopolitan society. And that idea is still valid today. The great future ahead of us would be to ensure there is more and more democracy in all countries. Unfortunately, I think we were on the right track, but now we're seeing more autocracy that is now taking over democracy. And it's not just me saying that, but we're seeing how the autocratic regimes are on the rise. Putin is a clear-cut case, but we've also seen the Xi Jinping's China's Congress that took place. That's a perfect example for you. So those autocracies are now on the rise. So all of the power is now residing in one single person in this countries, and democracies are slipping behind. We talk about weak or soft democracies or exhausted democracies. It's just not acceptable. We have to drive democracy as strongly as we can, ensure that democracy is here, present with us more and more, and that countries can become more democratic. With this, in the sense of the word that we have to understand, China says it's a democracy. Everyone can be a democracy. But what is it? I think the Kantian's Perpetual Peace Project was about that, ensuring that all countries became democratic so that we could be a full cosmopolitan society. I would sign up for that, definitely. I think this is a very important moment in time to avoid democracy. Democracy is still stepping back in recession. In La Vanguardia, we have published an interview with Robert Kaplan, who is an essay writer, a US author who's written a lot about geopolitics. And a few years ago, he wrote a book that was called The Revenge of Geography, I think was the title, and historical events since then have proved that he was absolutely right. He's a North American who's a realist, and I think he's a little perhaps pessimistic sometimes in his view on the world, but I was surprised by that article because there were two things that he pointed out, and he praised the European Union. He defined it as a generous regime. I think the European Union has been wonderful. It is an invention that we have to continue to support, and we have to defend what makes the European Union specific, because if you're going to look at a neoliberalist regime like the US, or a communist capitalist regime like China, and you see that the European Union is unique there, and we have to defend it because it is the way forward for democracy. And I think it has a lot of things it can do. It can make that contribution. It represents something in the world today. It is a type of social market economy that is on offer there. We've been talking here at this event about businesses and companies having to also take into account social governance and environmental criteria, and that is exactly what we have to foster. Those businesses, as Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner, would say, that help us to create society. And if that economist said that to who won the Nobel Prize, then they have to do that. Companies have to build those societies, and we have to drive that. I myself direct a foundation on ethics in businesses, and we have to teach businesses and universities to do that, to try and make those arrangements in the world so that we are better societies. And the European Union has a wonderful offering there. And that is, so yes, I agree with that. And if we can move into the last part of this interview, I know there's a little bit of time yet, but there's been another piece of news today. The British Prime Minister has resigned, and some people say, and I wrote this in an article the other day, that the British political crisis is a bit like the Mitterrand moment for neoliberalism. That was back in 1982. After being elected President of the Republic, he tried to implement an ambitious nationalization program in France, and it was going to be a failure after about 2 years. And that was probably the last time in general terms in European politics that a major nationalization program was on the cards. Maybe subsequently and specific moments in time, there were some individual cases of nationalizations of private companies, but I think with those 2 years of Mitterrand's regime, really, I think it was 1981-1983 and brought that to an end. But look now at what's happening in the UK. Is this the Mitterrand moment for neoliberalism? Thatcher's program can't work anymore because of the social reality today and the economic structures that exist today, that you can't possibly bring that back. Do you agree with that idea that this is a turning point now in our times? Yes, what I could agree with you on is that there is a trend in the world today of progress. Some people said that's not the case. I do think that the general direction has been towards progress despite COVID, which did, of course, interrupt that progress at some point. Then we've also seen the war in Ukraine, which has done the same. And now we've had the rise of autocracies, which is very serious. But now we're seeing nationalisms, closed nationalism, people looking inwards, China, Russia, the UK too. And this is completely the opposite to cosmopolitanism. It means that you're looking inwards, you're doing navel gazing, and you are short-sighted about everything. And that is a mistake, a huge mistake. And those countries that choose that option and those people that choose that option aren't choosing what we have to have today, that cosmopolitan vision, because otherwise you don't understand what's going on. We are interdependent. We rely on each other. We depend on each other. And even though at some point we might think we can be good enough on our own, we don't. We can't do that. We need other people. We have to be interdependent. And I think we have gradually learned that over time. And recently, the closed nationalisms, the short-sighted views of the world have raised their heads again. There are no borders for human beings. We always cross borders, and some authors say this, and I agree with this idea. And this is the cosmopolitan vision. We need that vision to understand the world. You can't understand the world if you take the local approach. If you are stuck in a closed world, you have to really see the full breadth of the visions. I can't talk about the British here. I don't like to do that, but I think they actually have been very short-sighted in the vision. And I don't think that Brexit can ever really be successful. I think this was something that really goes back to the media. I think it was all about social media and people talking to each other. It was a big mistake. And those other countries that's also closing ranks, Russia, China, it doesn't matter which country we're talking about, you can't possibly understand the world today unless you see the world as one block. We are one single world, and if we are to find the solutions that we deserve as human beings, you have to take that approach and you have to adopt solutions that are more and more solutions that bring countries together, bring people together, they're interdependent. I think the old anarchists were right when they said that self-help is what has made humankind more valuable or more powerful as a species than anything else, helping each other. And if people actually shut their doors on everybody else and don't realize they have to be interdependent, they will fail. I think there will be that failure. So helping each other, mutual help. Perhaps we could pick up on the last question. Now, you were talking about understanding the world and mutual assistance. Understanding the world is something that is difficult, and mutual help, helping each other, is a great concept too. But if you don't really understand what is happening in the world, then you tend to think about yourself and only yourself. You look at things as an individual. Everybody has some sort of fear. Some have lots of fears. The local elite groups who used to be stronger now feel that they are now being pushed down the list by stronger elite groups, the intermediaries who used to be very important in so many different sectors of the economy or the culture, are now also being questioned, or their position is now considered to be less important relatively. Journalists, that's one example. So this is a time of delocalization, and quite often we can see these difficulties arise, and there's a question that pops up here. Who's going to pay the bill? Who's going to foot the bill? And young people say, not us, we don't want to foot the bill. So the question is, will it be the old people who will foot the bill, particularly poor old people and women? Well, thank you for asking that question, because it's one of those questions that you get asked. You can really make people impressed by what you say. I've talked about aporophobia, in particular about the rejection of the poor. People talked about a lot in the past about xenophobia and people hating foreigners. But I don't think people actually hate foreigners. They hate poor foreigners. They hate that the migrants who are crossing the channel in a small boat, but not the rich immigrants who come into the country to spend money. And it comes from the Greek word, which was aporos, which means poor. And I was fortunate because this was a neologism that I came up with. I used to put it between quote marks, but it was then adopted into this, certainly into the Royal Academy Dictionary here in Spain. And it was even chosen, aporophobia, as the word of the year in that particular year, because I discovered personally that it did exist. This people hated poor people, aporophobia. If you have nothing interesting and nothing of interest to offer, then nobody is interested in you. If you can't actually vote for anybody, we have to combat all sorts of phobia like this one, because it is a very, very dangerous trend that we have, and we have to eradicate poverty now, don't we? It shouldn't just be a millennium goal, but it's a political, legal obligation that we have, and then there's also the rejection of old people that we have found has become more prevalent during pandemic, because there's also now talk about over 80-year-olds and the fact that they can't be taken to hospital. We just actually leave them behind because they're already 80. And when people used to say quite relieved, oh, lots of people have died, but they were old people, and they breathed a sigh of relief, saying, oh, well, they were ancient, they were old, and so we won't have so many problems paying pensions anymore. And this scornful view, or this rejection of old people, I mean, we also have old people who would just die off, perhaps too early. But there's absolutely no reason at all to feel that about any person. We all have the same worth, and no matter whether we are in the intensive care unit hospital. So we have to put a spotlight on all of these attitudes towards old people, I think. And it's our new future, I think, isn't it? Very shortly we will see this. And we're seeing that there are whole families that live off the pensioners because parents have to rely on grandparents to look after their children. And I think pensioners can even be profitable, but more than anything else, they deserve that attitude of dignity. We have to stop rejecting old people. All human beings are equal and of equal value. I think that's brought our conversation to an end. Thank you so much, Cortina.
Las dos expresiones, la del fin del localismo.
I'm going to pick up on that, the end of localism and the end of ageism or selfishness. And so we are beginning to move from these general principles. And now I'm going to introduce our next guest, Challenges and Trends in a Changing World. And so we're going to hear from the director of the Open Society European Institute in Brussels, Heather Grieb. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Good afternoon, everybody. Very great to be here and to join you in these. We've just had some great reflections on the long term and how our societies are changing. And I would like to go from that view of the long term, what's happened with COVID, or the recent challenges, and try to look forward further into the future at what the current crises over energy, over security, and over governance in Europe, and what they mean for all of us and how we can overcome them. So I'm going to talk about major changes in our operating environment, both macro and micro. This company is, for me, a particularly interesting one as the spine of the future energy system, where the transmission systems operators are going to be vital in new energy networks and new kinds of energy markets. And so it's a very apt place to think about these major system changes that are coming to us. So I'm going to give you an overview of some quite significant changes that we see in Europe in particular, which really affect the operating environment for all of us. So one is the way that energy has become politically so much more salient. People, the average citizen, used to have energy flowing into their house or their workplace or into their mode of transport. They would pay attention to the price, but they were not so conscious of where exactly it comes from, how it's generated, who profits from it, which country it's from, and how it might be maintained in the event of a crisis. But all of those issues are very much in the minds of Europeans now. Everybody's aware not only of the price of energy, but also where does it come from, how sustainable is it, what color is it? Is it green? Is it blue? Is it primarily coming from Russia? And this public attention to electricity generation in particular means that it's really important to think about the broader context in which electricity markets are going to be changed over the next years. So I just want to mention what I see, particularly in Brussels, where I work. I don't work on energy per se. I'm working on the broader climate transition. But I see some very important Europe-wide solutions. The search for solutions is very big. Of course, we're now completely aware of the need to reduce dependence on Russia. In fact, eliminate dependence on Russia is now very clearly the goal, and to do it very quickly. We have had an extraordinary level of change since the 24th of February this year. But there's also this question of how to build positive interdependence in energy across the EU. So we have the Germans pleading for solidarity. Who could have expected that 10 years ago? We have the need for interconnections and the need for reverse flow. So you see that in gas. You also see the need for the grid that many in Spain have been asking for across the Pyrenees, for example, finally to be built, both on gas and electricity. So this positive independence and being able to rely on a Europe-wide system is now very much at the forefront of policy debates and concerns, to an extent that I think there's a lot more strategic and long-term thinking going on than there has been in the past. But there needs to be that work at EU level, but there also has to be work also at regional, national, and local level. What's really interesting about what's happening in the energy transition now is it's not only about continent-wide solutions and networks and grids, it's also about producing energy as locally as possible. If you look at what's in the most recent Commission packages on, for example, rooftop solar, it's very clear that the need to build a lot more resilience into the energy system is leading to a focus on producing energy as close to where it is, to generate it as close to where it's being used as possible. So I think in the future we will be looking at in a way, two levels of major change. At the top level, the idea of integration across the continent, integration even with, for example, Moldova and Ukraine. So with the wider Europe, there's the EU and also the wider Europe. Already, I think those of you who work in electricity know about the synchronization of the Ukrainian and Moldovan grids with the European grid that happened in very difficult circumstances back in March. So we've got a kind of wider Europe sense of an energy market and an energy generation system. And we also have this extremely local sense of communities producing their own energy through rooftop solar, through the siting of a wind turbine being decided by a local level democratic assembly, for example. Also of communities thinking about going off-grid and generating their own energy themselves. So these changes at the very top level and also right at the local level are happening simultaneously. And of course, TSOs have a major role in this change, particularly, as I mentioned, as the spine of new energy networks. But this brings major challenges with it. And I think there are a few policy trends I just want to point out, which I think are really going to drive what happens in terms of shaping future energy systems and markets. One is a much, much higher level of state intervention than we've seen in the past 4 decades. And this is not only in Europe, but also in the United States, where we've seen in the Inflation Reduction Act, recently brought forward by the Biden administration, for example, a level of intervention that would have been anathema to former presidents like Ronald Reagan, who said, the problem is government. No longer do people see that as the case. Now it's all about the role, the responsibility of the state in ensuring resilience. So not only does economic policy at the level of the state have to aim for efficiency, creating efficient systems that deliver to customers at the lowest price possible, but also resilient systems. And often public investment is needed to create those resilient systems, as well as regulation. So it's about investment, and we've seen with the Inflation Reduction Act a big focus on fiscal incentives to do this. Whereas in Europe, we tend to focus more on regulation, partly because we don't have fiscal capacity at EU level, but also because we are a regulatory superpower. That's what Europe really specializes in. And in fact, many of the norms and standards and regulatory power of the EU at this beginning point in the big system change to climate neutrality, these will become global norms and standards. So the EU's role in intervening in its energy markets now is going to create norms and standards that also move to other regions. So why are we going to see so much more state intervention in the future? Well, because market failure has been so obvious. Market failure in terms of a toxic dependency, which, by the way, was also the decision of particular states. You know, I think it's very interesting how much mea culpa is going on in Berlin from both Christian Democrats and Social Democrats about the degree of dependence on Russia. But we can also, there are other member states that are guilty of this as well. But also because there's been a market failure in building the infrastructure and the other assets that countries need to ensure their energy security. We've relied too much on pipelines from Russia. We've also relied too much on pipelines in general, and we've failed to do the energy transition to renewables and to low carbon until now, when we've been forced to do it in a big hurry, and therefore it's being done often in a way that is very expensive, quite inefficient, and doesn't bring the public along. So the need for the state and the market to work together to make sure that these emission reductions happen, as well as energy security being ensured, to have those twin goals of energy security and also of the climate transition to happen. There's got to be an orderly transition, and that requires states as well as markets. So I think we're going to see a much more expansive role in everything from building and retiring fossil fuel infrastructure to influencing where private companies buy and sell energy, through to limiting emissions, through carbon pricing, through subsidies, through mandates, through standards. The EU will have a key role in all of that. But what's not quite clear is how far the EU and the US will be able to work together to cooperate on this, how much they'll be doing their own thing in their particular systems. But we can also see the way that there's a focus now in state intervention both on correcting market failures to provide state security and also to make the climate transition happen, but also building lead markets. You can see that very clearly now in the hydrogen strategies that are being developed both at EU level and also in national governments. The idea of creating markets in order to encourage the infrastructure investment by the private sector and to ensure that there will be also the infrastructure to distribute it. Now, pricing is a huge issue in electricity, and the Commission is now working on having quite a fierce internal debate about how electricity prices should be set. We've had a system that's worked for many decades, now it's going to change. But how do you have a public debate about a subject like that? Very technical. It's very complicated, moving away from spot prices to, for example, nodal pricing and this kind of thing. Requires the creation of new kinds of markets. I'd be very interested in your views, if we get a chance to talk about this, in how to do it. But this is the kind of area where I think the state intervention in terms of changing pricing mechanisms is going to be really big. And then there's this issue, of course, of raw materials for renewables, where we now see a nexus of geopolitics, market regulation, and industrial policy. Our relationships as Europeans with China and the US are going to be increasingly dominated by this question of the geopolitics of energy. There's a real risk that we move away from one toxic dependency on Russia to others. So dependency now on other fossil fuel autocrats. It's not pleasant that we're signing new fossil fuel contracts with other autocrats beyond Putin in other parts of the world. But also, of course, toxic dependency on China, which controls, depends how you count it, but around about 90% of the supply chains for the renewables that we need for our decarbonisation. And in addition to the political implications of being so dependent on China for our decarbonisation and for our ultimate energy security, there's also the fact that China needs those renewables for its own decarbonisation. China has got very serious about reducing its emissions and its climate policy. And so there is an absolute shortage at the moment. I don't know how many of you have recently tried to buy a solar panel, but I can tell you that in Belgium, you can't get one for love nor money. If you can put your name on the list for a solar panel, and you might get one in 6 months' time, possibly 9 months' time, but nobody can tell you what price you will pay in 6 months or 9 months. You know, it's like when COVID, we suddenly discovered there was a massive shortage of masks and all kinds of things that we needed. We're suddenly discovering that dependency on these long supply chains, particularly ones controlled by one country, it's really a problem. And of course, China is not only the chief manufacturer of solar panels, and increasingly also moving into wind turbines and so on, but of course, China controls the supply chain. The copper and the cobalt mines in the DRC, the refining of the cobalt to turn it into chemicals for lithium-ion batteries, also the processing. China's what processes almost all of Australia's lithium, and of course China's the biggest battery manufacturer, producing a third of the wind power and more than 70% of the solar panels, with most of the polysilicon produced in Xinjiang. That raises a whole host of issues and problems which was not really alive in public debate until this year. And this problem that renewables pose geopolitically is one that we're going to have to grapple with for quite a long time to come, because the sources of renewable power are very well distributed across the globe. You can produce renewable power in many different places through many different methods, but the critical raw materials to produce the clean technology to actually generate the power, those are quite concentrated at the moment. Now, one way of dealing with that is to start mining again in Europe. And I think in Spain there's quite a lot of experience of this. And it's not an experience that most of the population would want to return to. So how do you get a social license to start mining again in our densely populated European countries? And also, not only the mining, but the processing of mining, which is hugely polluting. So these questions about what does our energy security require, What kinds of industrial policy does it require? What kinds of thinking about what will give us autonomy are really going to be huge issues over the years to come. We see, for example, the Raw Materials Act that the Commission is now preparing, which is one of the key initiatives for the coming year. The Commission has made an estimate that the demand for critical raw materials will increase by 500% by 2030, owing both to the green transition, but also, of course, the digital transition, which is a very energy-intensive transition. And this need for active investment is very tricky. And also the other side of it, which is reducing demand for raw materials by moving to a circular economy, moving to much more recycling and reuse of not only raw materials, but also components and for example, used phones and cars and all the rest of it, is going to be critical as well. So, okay, these are some big policy trends that are happening now, and I see a lot of this at EU level. Then there's the societal level. What does a fair energy transition actually mean? This is a project that the Open Society European Policy Institute, which I work for, has been involved with a number of other organizations, where we've been looking at how the vulnerable in European societies, so in fact, just to refer back to the previous session, the poor, the old, those who don't have the means to actually control their own energy supply, how are they going to cope with this? And I just wanted to give you just a little snapshot of the complexities of this. We've got all this stuff going on at EU level, huge changes in the markets, huge changes in the role of the state. And then down at the bottom of society, you've got the people who are trying to live their daily lives and get the energy that they need for that. And we did a series of focus groups with people who are vulnerable, people who are of low socioeconomic status, low levels of income, who don't have the means to make an energy transition themselves, and ask them, what do you think about what would be a fair energy transition? And some very interesting findings, and there was in fact one of the focus groups was in Spain. 900 citizens were involved. These are focus groups, it's not a poll, so it's not calling people up and asking them on by phone, it's actually, they're in a room discussing it among themselves. On the whole, vulnerable people are actually very aware of the dangers of climate change, and they believe in the need for action. More than 85% of them think that we as people should do all that we can to move to climate neutrality as fast as we can. They don't always see the links between climate change and energy because it's not always obvious to them why changing energy system is needed in order to reduce emissions and climate change. But more significantly, they don't know how they can participate in the energy transition. They are really concerned about the fact that they can't even control their own, not only their own energy bills, but their own energy consumption. Many people live in, for example, housing where the landlord simply divides up the bill between the different apartments, the different tenants, regardless of how much they consume. Or they have a meter, which they have to, put coins into, or they have to pay for, but where they can't control where the energy comes from, what kind of contract there is, whether it's gas, whether it's electricity, whatever it is. They definitely don't have the power to install solar panels. And they emphasize the need for the energy transition to minimize inequalities, but they feel they lack the means and the power to take action. So these are the customers, the ultimate customers, but they're the ones who don't have a say, either politically or economically, in the energy transition. So I think this is a very interesting project. We're now going on to the next phase, is what to do about this, how to engage people, how they can be involved. But it's just a snapshot of the complications of moving to climate neutrality in a situation where most people want change towards climate neutrality, but they feel they do not have agency. They cannot themselves participate in the way that they would like to. And they don't see the scale of the change coming. So this is a bit of a kind of, in a way, a simple way of thinking about it. But you've got the little wave was COVID. Make sure to wash your hands and everything will be fine. Then we have the recession coming. Now we've got climate change, and people are starting to realize that climate change is coming because of the extreme weather this summer, the heat waves, the floods, the drought. Everybody's now begun to understand it. But in fact, biodiversity collapse could have a bigger impact on us all than climate change may do. But the thing is, it's quite difficult to wait for government action. Governments are very busy coping with the immediacies of the recession, of the war, and so on. And the need to get ahead of political leadership and conventional investors is becoming evident to quite a lot of actors in society. So the question is how to manage this transition in a way that maintains democratic consent. This is a whole of society, whole of economy transition that will need to be going for several decades. And this is something that our representative democracy, as it has evolved since the 19th century, is not very good at coping with. Most of us get the chance to vote every 4 or 5 years. We don't really have that much of a say on exactly how policies get implemented and so on. And yet, this is going to affect all of us. And that is going to lead to more protest votes, more populism in the short term. And it's very hard to give people a sense of the longer term and of the vision that's needed. We have also a bit of a carbon tunnel vision. This is just a little diagram to point out how net zero carbon emissions are only one part of true net zero and a sustainable future. So we're focusing a lot on carbon emissions. Think about COP27 coming up, will be a lot about that. But actually there's all these other things going on, particularly biodiversity loss, water crisis, something that is very well known here, resource scarcity. These are all, and overconsumption and the links between these two. All of these are key factors. So where do we get to? I just give you a little highlight of this is a report that we've produced on the system change compass, how to make the system change happen by building an economic model that can increase well-being within planetary boundaries, the donut model as it is, transform the fundamentals of socioeconomic systems, and be able to meet societal needs, human needs within planetary boundaries, both for Europe and other regions. Because ultimately, we're going to have to make this whole thing work politically and economically in a time of crisis, of recession and of war, and also of major changes. On the whole, societies aren't very good at doing that. We tend to be focused, particularly political attention tends to focus on short term, what are the immediate concerns, and not think about the long term. We're now reaping the results of having done that for too long. And we have to think about it systemically. We have to think about how energy markets are going to work in future, about the changes at the top level of continent-wide, but also at the bottom level of the local production. And I'm very curious to know your thoughts, your views on how we can make this happen, because it's something which needs to be managed politically, but not only by politicians. In a way, it's too important to be left to political leaders alone. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias. Déjame preguntarle dos cosas más. Please don't go away. Estamos hablando.
We're talking about the short and the long term, and you mentioned something that I found really interesting, and I wanted to ask you.
A new state of mind. I mean, you're saying we are changing the paradigm, the model, or this is just a state of war, that we are doing all this because of the war, because of the urgency of this. Ha cambiado la...
So has the general perception changed, or is it simply because we are in this state of war and that's why we're being driven to partnerships that are not particularly to be recommended, like Saudi Arabia and so on? So is this a new state of mind or just a state of war?
Look back on history, almost the worst time to try and change your system is under conditions of war. The Ukrainians are having to do that now by completely changing. They're going to have to change their energy infrastructure as Russia destroys it. But it has to happen. And what we see at the moment is measures which, we see two different kinds of measures going on at EU level, and also by individual member states like Germany, where some are both moving away from the dependency on Russia and serving, therefore, the war aim, and they are also fostering the system transition. Others, of course, are very bad for the system transition, but moving forward. There are many very poor trade-offs being made. So, for example, we're now going to be importing lots and lots of liquefied natural gas, LNG. We're building LNG terminals. This is infrastructure that will become stranded assets within a few years. So it's actually a very bad investment, but we're doing it to get through this winter, to keep German industry running, to keep the lights on, to keep the heating working for most of Europe. It's not a good thing to do. But then if you think about the balance of the energy mix between that and burning more coal, which produces even more emissions of a worse kind, versus trying to maintain nuclear capacity, which is expensive and also has a long time horizon. There are many bad options, and we're having to choose all of the options. There are good ones, there are bad ones, and there are terrible ones. We're doing them all at the moment. The question is, how much money do we waste on the bad options to get through this winter when we need that money to invest in future winters in the renewables?
And do you think that that goodwill, the choosing the lesser evil, is going to fade away? The minute the war stops, this goodwill will stop? La buena voluntad en la que estamos.
So this willingness to drive this transformation, do you think it will go on once the war is over? The state intervention and the new paradigm, is that going to be over?
Is the war doesn't look like it's likely to stop anytime soon. There will be a pause this winter because of wintry conditions, but the Russians are going to prepare for another onslaught in the spring. This war could be with us for several years to come, and it could become even worse than it is now. So we have to think of this as something we have to do under the war conditions. Now, the way that the war has changed public perceptions is a wake-up call. It's made people much more aware of the dangers of dependency on Russian gas, and people are aware of the need to have solidarity, to turn down the thermostat, to save energy, to a certain extent. But of course, all of the confusion about price caps and subsidies is not giving them a clear enough price signal that it's going to be like this for years to come. And I think that's the key thing. The public, people really need to have a sense that this is a long-term transition. This isn't just because Putin is making hell in Ukraine. It's because we needed to do this anyway.
Me queda un minuto y voy a abusar.
You have 1 minute left. I'm going to use it. You mentioned the vulnerable.
Population. We have a trend here in Spain. We've seen that very clearly. Vulnerable people do not vote. They don't go to vote. So in terms of policy making, do you think that we are going to have legislation for the rich, legislation for people who actually vote, who are, white, rich, and educated? Estamos diciendo que hay una población vulnerable a la que todos estamos mencionando.
We're saying that there's this vulnerable population that everyone's mentioned, but they never vote. There's an absolute linear relationship between the intention to vote and income levels. So.
The elected government doesn't only deliver for its voters, but for the whole country. And
that's the theory, right?
That's the theory.
That's
The question is then, what are the incentives for political parties? But I think we've seen in recent years the growth of populist parties, Vox is an example of this, which have picked up the votes of people who hadn't voted before, who have said to those who are completely fed up with the existing parties, don't feel represented by them, I'll represent you. They don't necessarily do a good job of it, but that's a very powerful call. And I think the risk is that if the climate transition is seen only to deliver results for the middle classes, for the white, the rich, those who drive cars, those who own houses, then there's going to be massive pushback against it. We can have gilets jaunes all over Europe. And this would be a disaster. It's a disaster both for the climate change for our children, our grandchildren, even us in our later years. But it's also a disaster for democracy because it means that we can't actually manage long-term system change. It means that we are just reacting with each election to the current circumstances, making it worse for ourselves. Now, human beings are actually we're not that good at thinking long-term. We tend to focus on what's immediately in front of us. But the physical reality of climate change is making itself felt. And if you can say to people, look, the government is working to make sure next summer a heat wave, a drought is going to have less of an impact on everybody, then that's a way of maintaining it. So I think it has to be about these broader goals which are both for all in society, not just for the car drivers and the homeowners, but also for the vulnerable.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Les pido un aplauso.
Let's give a round of applause to Heather, Director of the Policy Institute in Brussels. Thank you.
decía al principio que
I was saying early on that we divided up this event this afternoon literally into these three different sections. That first section, general principles and a long-term vision looking ahead in the timeline. And I think we've done that, haven't we? We can tick the box on that one. So now we'll move on to the practical application part of the event and what people are doing. And there are two different things here. We've got the players here and we've got the regulators as well. So we're going to listen to both sides. First of all, we're going to hear from the entrepreneurs who are involved in the whole development process. We'll be listening to the businesses, the companies who are also there. And then we'll hear from the regulators in the financial market. We'll hear from the government and the European Commission. Let me introduce the next panel and welcome our entrepreneurs, Alberto Escalero from Eluit, Gerard Fernandez, who is the CEO of NGD, and David Pistoni from Celeros. How are you? Come up. Welcome to the three of you. Come and sit down here. I've been told that you're in charge in this session. I was told that they know what they have to do. So I will give you the floor one by one. And the only thing I would tell you is watch the clock. It's the clock that's really in charge. Tell us what you do exactly. What are you developing exactly? Alberto, you first. Good afternoon to all of you. I've come along today to give you a very quick soundbite on an innovation project called Smart Village, which has been developed with the collaboration of Smart Next Machina, Espasat and Eluit under our venture client program. This is an annual program that we launch to work together with startups within the scope of RIDEA. So this pilot project brings together, on the one hand, the know-how of Next Machina in wireless communications, IoT, and sensors, and also, on the other hand, capability in satellite technologies provided by Hispasat. The outcome of this collaboration is that we can equip with digitalization and communication for municipal areas in tiny little villages, in remote areas. In the case of this pilot, we worked with a little village in Guipúzcoa, up in the Basque Country in the Sierra de Alar Mountains. What services do we provide? Wi-Fi, satellite-based Wi-Fi for those shepherds that are up there in the mountains working with no communication or signal, then also to be able to control their livestock. This once again for the shepherds. This includes detection and prevention for forest fires. On top of that, there are municipal services that are provided relating to waste management or the management of public lighting in the area. And there's one more service, which is how to check on and control tourism and their monitoring of people getting access into the parks and reserves in the area. What came out of this pilot project? Well, I have to say first and foremost that the key aim was to help those municipal areas in remote parts of the countries that didn't have that signal or communication, so we could close their digital gap and provide them with all of these different services and capabilities. And that being said, a picture, as I say, is worth 1,000 words, and we have a video for you. Yes, go ahead. The Internet of Things is a unique opportunity to drive digital development in all of our productive sectors. However, if we're not able to guarantee universal rollout of this technology, we'd simply be widening that digital gap that exists in some areas, and particularly I'm thinking about rural parts of the country. Espasat guarantees full high-quality service there all over the countries. As you can see with this project, we have an Next Machina and Eluit. The very first project that we're doing is in this mountain range, the Sierra de Alar. In Nex Machina, we have spent the last 9 years working in the field of digitalization using wireless communication technologies that we apply to different sectors. In this particular case, in Sierra de Lara, in Italy and Aranaz, we're using technologies that help to provide different municipal services offered by the town hall. These rural areas tend to run into difficulties when they're trying to roll out digital projects, and what we want to do in Ex Machina is help them set up those projects. Some of the solutions that we've implemented here in this area, could be for waste management, public lighting, control of tourists, so that people can know what car park spaces are available to them. Environmental checks and controls, which are becoming more and more necessary. People are asking for these, particularly since COVID, to ensure that all of the facilities, public facilities, are in the best possible state, thinking about visits. So this is all about the digital world, isn't it? We want to improve digitalization and save money too in this project. Gerard, over to you. Go ahead. Hello, I'd like to introduce our video with an exercise to stretch your imagination. It's a role-play exercise. It's pretty straightforward. Just imagine that all of us here are in a part of a rescue team in the mountains, the high mountains in the Teide mountain range, and we're told that there are a British couple, old pensioners, that have got lost. We haven't heard from them for 8 hours. The only thing we know about that couple is that they were wearing their flip-flops and they with their socks on, and they were on the way up the mountain. Yes. So this is a critical situation. We have to get going straight away in 2 minutes. But we have lots of equipment. We have a helicopter waiting to take us there. But the problem is we have no signal. We have no communication, and we have no coverage there. So when we go off and try and track these couple to find them, we can't get in touch with each other. And if we also have a problem, if we get hurt, we won't know who has been hurt, and we couldn't actually get the helicopter in there. I'm explaining a real case to you. This is a real-life case, and this happens in the Teide National Park in the Canary Islands, and it's very, very hard for them to be in touch. Our company, Engidi, what it does, essentially, is provide those electronic devices that can connect up with different operators there working in different sectors. But thanks to Hispasat, we can bring together two technologies. Satellite technology is one technology that we use to connect our devices, and two, we can guarantee that the people who are saving others have the right equipment. So off we go. Well, let's go and save them. Let's see the video. Cut to the video. Well, usually here in the Teide National Park and the forest area in Tenerife and other parts of the Canary Islands, we end up having to go into these places where there is no telephone signal. If we can't get in touch with the people who are lost or need help, then we can't help them, and we have to evacuate them from that area. If we've got no connection, no connectivity, we won't be able to actually get back to our base and get more help with a helicopter or whatever we need to help them. The challenge is to be able to digitalize our search and rescue methods in the Red Cross. With energy, we will be able to identify the extraction point and be able to take in the helicopter to rescue these people. We will also be able to call in more support, more resources. We need to get empirical data so we know where they are, at what height they are, and that means that our rescue operation will be safer and more efficient. The solution Energy and Hispasat provides is to give us satellite technologies. The antenna is set up on the roof of the vehicle, so we can get internet connectivity and broadcast to any part of the world all of the information coming through the NGD devices. So this is all goes through the antenna up to the cloud, and anybody with access to the internet can receive the information. So we don't have to do the communication ourselves. We're always in a hurry, and our minds are at rest. We know that if anything happens to anybody, they'll also be able to warn us that in real time, and we'll know where they are. They'll know where we are. We can send people information on where to go to, and once we localize the people, we'll be able to help them. Connectivity can save lives. And there's one third company to introduce itself. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues here and to be part of this event. In our case, this started off as a university project in 2015 in the Polytechnic University in Valencia. We as students got together to try and find how we could meet this challenge that came from the US, from SpaceX, and the idea was how to come up with a new method of transportation. We won one of the key awards in that competition. We came back to Spain and Valencia, and apart from continuing as a university team, we became a company at the same time, and we've carried on with the journey. So the company is called Celeros. 54 of us are working in the company. We're business experts, we're engineers, we're people who know about the industry or marketing, and we want to take up this challenge. Technology is fine, isn't it? But I think all of us agree on this. We need more people. What's the basic concept that we're working on here? It's the natural step forward after these high-level, these magnetic height trains that they have in China. Apart from friction, we bring in a low-pressure environment. These are semi-evacuated tubes. So as the global friction there is very low, we can actually have a lower energy consumption but high speeds. And the idea is to set up a network between capital cities operating at around 2,000 kilometers. That's the speed, so high speed. It depends on the frequency there. It's totally electric, and there's total protection for the external facilities, and there is lower energy consumption. We also have a 2050 vision project. You can see that on our website. You can see our Hyperloop international network that we're envisaging, and we've been working with people from other countries. That is the future vision. But today, things are happening. About 2 billion euros are being spent on different projects all over Europe. There's at least 7 companies working in the world. The Korean government, the Chinese government are investing. There's an American company, there's a Canadian company. There are 3 companies in Europe, and we're one of them. So things are moving now, and we're testing these systems, and we're driving the regulation there so that there can be consistency in Europe in our different projects, and gain experience. In Spain, well, we have a lot of experience behind us. We have a high-speed rail link. We know how to manage this sort of project, and we're showing that we can make a big impact here. In our company, we are building some prototypes to validate these technologies. And we see the project as part of an ecosystem. It's not just a single ad hoc startup, it's more than that. And we collaborate as much as we can with researchers and people in other businesses, with our investors too. Redea is one of our biggest backers, Capgemini, etc., etc. If we didn't have that ecosystem, we wouldn't be in where we are today. What are our next steps apart from the prototypes that we're already running? We're integrating technologies to work out the next phases in the development process and to collaborate with all of the other players worldwide. What's different about what we're doing? We want to bring the technology into the vehicle itself so we can cut down the per kilometre cost, which is absolutely essential if this is to work in the future. And we're also simplifying the regulatory side of things because we have a compression system, which means that the pressure in the tube can be a bit higher. I think we're a bit like planes more than anything else. If you could get some idea of how this would work. And our video's shorter than that, by the way. That's why I'm talking for a long time. Yeah, it's your business card. What else can I tell you? Redea's support has been important. We're getting institutional support nationally and in Europe as well. But as management of complex infrastructures, Redea's team have been helping us with that. And that's it. Okay, let's see your calling card. What was that? 1,600 something kilometers per hour? Is that right? Well, that's the absolute limit for us. I have one question. I know we're running short of time, and your calling cards were good and all beautifully produced. So very quick questions. Who has to drive this? The private sector, you, or the public sector? Let me start. Can I? Yeah, keep it short though. I wouldn't say it has to be one or the other. I think both have to collaborate together. So business, public with public sector. Of course, if you get the public sector support, then it will make your life easier to develop. But you need to also get corporate support to back us. No, I think you're all going to copy what he's just said all together. Let me ask the question differently. Who is driving this? Is it the public sector or the private? Who shouldn't? I'm not saying who should do it, but who is doing it? Well, I'm not sure about the public sector or the private, but it's more of an ecosystem, isn't it? Innovation development requires money. There are public sector plans that help, but quite obviously, the private sector shouldn't end up just being a graveyard for pilot projects. It has to gain experience, but it needs to get bigger and better. So yes, it's an ecosystem. In our case, I think I'd have to check the figure, but I think it's about 85% or 75%, 25% private and public funding. Apart from the public subsidies that we can get, there's a certain amount of institutional support there for the sort of traction in the private sector. We also want to apply our technologies in other sectors. We want to make sure that we're on the right road, but if you don't get institutional support, if you don't get a big budget figures behind you, you'll end up in death value, which is when you hit the bottom of the pile somewhere through the projects. In our case, isn't any exception to that. Gerard, David, and Alberto, thank you to all three of you. I think we'll hear a lot about you. Remember their names, everybody. Thank you.
Les decía que íbamos a empezar a escuchar jugadores. Estos
I said that we were going to start listening to dreamers. These are, of course, the new entrepreneurs. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about them in the future. And now let me introduce not the old ones, but the well-established ones. Let's say, let's listen to Redeia and Enagas and Exolum. We're going to start with the risks of non-sustainability. So the opposite starting point. Let me introduce Redeia's CEO, Roberto García, Arturo Gonzalo, CEO of Enagas, and Rosa García, chairwoman of Exolum. Go ahead and welcome. Of course, well established but young, all three of them.
sepan lo primero, esto, que los relojes mandan.
Of course, first, you should be aware of the fact that we have limited time, but also that a lot of people are following this online, and there's some members of the media here. And so I'm going to start asking the two of you about the new mid-cap signature. It's been announced by Pedro Sanchez and Costa and Macron. It's not really like the old MidCat. It's Barcelona-Marseille, and it's not exactly just gas. It will allow for gas, but not just gas, green hydrogen. And so I'm going to ask the two of you, Enagas and Red Eléctrica, what do you think? Well, we know so far what's in the press release of the three governments. And of course, we want to hear more details. And I suppose we'll get those in the summit that has been announced for December 9th. But I think it's definitely a great success for all three governments and great news for Europe. I think it's an agreement which has a very strong component of solidarity, and that is a message that Europe needs to hear right now. But also, it's a clear focus on decarbonization. And so I think that it seems a very solid technical proposal, and it minimizes the social and environmental impact. So whilst we hear more details of the project, I think it's great news for Europe and for Spain. And Rosa, I'm going to skip you unless you want to say something about it. No, that's fine, because I'm not in that sector. And there's very little information available as now, and so you really can't say much more than what Arturo's just said. Roberto, I agree with Arturo. Any piece of news that's about increasing Spain's interconnection with the rest of Europe is really good news, whether it's about gas or electricity. As you know, we have been trying to increase our interconnections with France and with Europe for many years, and so it's very good news, very, very good news, certainly. And next year, I'm sure we will also move forward with the submarine interconnection with France, but there's still a significant deficit, so it's very good news for Spain, for infrastructures in Spain, and for Europe in general. Right, and so now let's go for the long-term perspective. Journalists have to ask you about this today, definitely. And so having spoken about this, let's talk about all the other topics. And I'm saying we're not going to describe what I'm referring to with the rest of it. We have this war with a twofold impact, financial and environmental. We also have a situation of maybe stagflation as well as high inflation, which is lasting far too long and is staying far too high. And I don't know whether we can say stagnation, but we're definitely not seeing the high growth rates that were expected. The OECD is predicting a pretty complex situation. We're all afraid, of course, of how that's going to affect employment. And so let's talk about this, risks, and also the risks of non-sustainability, talking about renewable energies, geopolitical risks, the just transition we were just talking about, and opportunities for the future. So I'm going to organize all of this, of course, which is a very complex set of topics. But Roberto, let's start with you first. We currently have a plan to increase the contribution of renewables up to 45%. We have this new interconnection with France coming up, plus the new announcement today. We have the risks of brownouts, blackouts, selective blackouts, as people have said. Is that a real risk? Well, thank you for asking me that question, because I think the first thing we have to do is to give citizens some comfort. So I don't think in Spain we have any sort of blackout risk right now or any restrictions to electricity supply. Our country is quite privileged in terms of its infrastructures because our generation mix is very balanced. Over 50% of our generation mix comes from renewables. And so beyond fossil fuels, we have quite a lot of margins. So the answer is no, there's no risk. It will be a complex winter for some European countries more than others. But certainly for Spain, the answer is clearly no, there's no risk of that. And Arturo can say also that our dependence on Russian gas was always a lot lower than that of other countries in Europe. And plus, from November, we're going to have a management instrument for very extreme cases, which is demand management, which in an extreme scenario could be the last resort to be considered. But there's really no risk. For now, we have a very robust system and a very balanced system. I'm going to be asking really soon, but what about costs? Because, of course, all of this has costs. This whole transition has costs. And earlier you were saying that we're moving towards more expensive energy sources and more expensive generation. But how are we going to manage so that those costs will not mean less renewable generation or more pollution? Well, I think we need to understand that renewables are the cheapest energy source. And we've seen that in the Spanish electricity system in the last years already. And so the costs of not moving forward with the energy transition, we're feeling now with the situation in Europe right now. And so what we have to do actually is to speed up the transition. And in Spain, our starting point is very good, I would say. I'll just remind you that a year ago, almost half of electricity demand was covered with renewable energy. 2 years ago, average electricity prices was 40 euros a megawatt. That clearly demonstrates that accelerating the energy transition means lower prices, and the cost of not doing it, unfortunately, we're seeing right now in Europe. And so I think the message is very clear. We need to accelerate the transition. That's the answer. So it's more expensive not to do it than to do it. Exactly. And let me ask, Enagas, we're saying 83% of primary demand from fossil fuels. We're saying that there's some targets for 2050. So let me ask first, are these targets realistic? Are we going to make it? Okay, let me just thank Redella for inviting us to participate here. Thank you very much. And Javier, now I'm going to answer your question. I think those targets are realistic, and actually it's crucial that we achieve them. The goal of having zero net emissions by 2050 is absolutely essential. And so what we have to do is provide the means to achieve it as soon as possible, and actually before 2050. But it is perfectly achievable. And as Roberto has said, it makes sense, not just in terms of sustainability, but also financially. Particularly at a time when we see how security of supply is a vulnerability. We need to accelerate decarbonization by developing infrastructures that will enable us to deploy decarbonization faster, and which short-term will give us more flexibility, more diversity in our energy sources, because that's also an element which improves competitiveness. In fact, since the war in Ukraine began, we have seen a reversal of the situation that happened before in Europe, whereby Spain's gas prices or energy prices were higher than those of our neighbors. But since the beginning of the conflict, Spain, which has a very diversified supply, has constantly demonstrated lower gas reference prices than our European neighbors. And we have been calculating from February 24th, the average discount between the reference gas price in Spain and that in Europe is 32 euros per megawatt hour versus TTF. And if we multiply gas consumption in Spain from the beginning of the conflict till today, that adds up to 7.8 billion euros versus TTF in an infrastructure where building regasification plants has cost us a total of 4.5 billion. So having the infrastructure will enable us to accelerate our decarbonization, but at the same time, it also means significant competitive savings at a time when having less infrastructure means more or less diverse supply sources and higher costs. And can the war derail us there? Because talking about decarbonization, Germany is having to burn coal again and using less clean energy sources, but which now temporarily are a little cheaper. So do you think the war might derail us from achieving those long-term targets? I actually think that it might do that only very temporarily and only minimally. What is clearly a fact is that medium and long term, the solution is to accelerate decarbonization. I was in Berlin this week in the context of Their Majesty's visit to Germany, and what they ask you there in Germany is when and how will Spain become a net renewable hydrogen exporter to help countries like Germany, which have fewer resources, achieve their zero net emission targets. So it's true that temporarily they may have to resort to some other more polluting energy sources, which we thought were a thing of the past, but medium and long term, certainly the solution is decarbonization. Rosa Garcia, there's 2 or 3 numbers that are a bit shocking, and I want your take on them. Global energy consumption will be growing 50% in the next 30 years, between now and 2050. Still? Or are we going to have to curtail that demand and have less energy consumption from now on, given these prices? No, I think those figures, which you've probably gotten from the International Energy Agency, are accurate, whether we like it or not. We have to understand that there's still a very large part of the world's population that has no access to electricity, and another group who will be becoming members of the middle classes soon and who will hope to enjoy a quality of life which does require energy consumption. And so what's going to happen, I think, is 2 things. First, we are going to get used to doing more with less. That is, there will be major investments in energy efficiency so that the unit generated per kilowatt hour will be a lot higher than what we have now. So we will have a lot of technology that will help us do more with less energy. And the second thing that's going to happen is we're going to be using increasingly clean energy. And so there will be new technologies plus batteries and hydrogen and electrification, of course, gradually will move us away from using fossil fuels and use technologies that are a lot cleaner. And there's something you've said which leads me to a question. Everything you're saying has a cost, and it's a very high cost. But is there a risk that this might cause a growing divide in terms of countries with clean energies, that would be the richer countries, or countries with dirtier energy, the poorer, or even within the same country, differences in different population segments? But this is more to do with what might derail this whole process, which seems to be what you're trying to get us to speak about. in this whole energy transition process. And clearly, what might derail us in this whole effort? Well, there's three things that might derail this energy transition. And the first has to do with it not being global. Just like what's happened with vaccines, if not everyone's vaccinated, no one's safe. With this decarbonization, it's the same. The European Union can't draw up borders and say, well, no climate change for us because we're decarbonized. That's just not going to work. And so we're all going to make an effort, and we're all going to have to pitch in, both politically in order to convince the governments who can, but who won't, because they decide that now it might be more competitive short term to keep their costs down by not making these investments, because as you said, everything has a cost, including having a cleaner industry. And governments who want to but who can't, like countries in the third world, for example, who do know they have to change their generation mix but who are unable to do so. And socially, with our citizens, it's the same. There are some who want to but who can't, and there are those who can but who won't. And so the second area where we might be derailed has to do with how we plan all this. And I'm a mathematician by profession, and I think it's really important to use a nice Excel sheet and think, okay, we're in a position, as you've said very clearly, where energy is being generated using mostly fossil fuels. And we know, like in a chemical equation, where we want to get to. We want to get to a point in 2050 where we will have zero CO2 emissions. And in between, it's no use to have over-optimistic theories or just political approaches. What you need are plans, and very concrete plans and milestones, because if you get it wrong in the plans, and if you think, for example, that you will be able to decarbonize or that you will be using less oil than you're actually going to use, and reality eventually catches up with us, if we do that but we don't have enough renewables to offset that, what we're going to have is an energy deficit overall, which means that the oil-producing countries will be able to charge us a lot more than they would have charged us if they'd had production tailored to our consumption, or we will have an electricity generation deficit again. So it's really important to have a very practical and realistic analysis, considering all technologies and understanding when you have to accelerate on one or the other, and how much you're going to decarbonize, and also at what cost. Because of course there's that third element that could derail us, which is the social component. If we have an energy transition that only benefits the few because the costs are so high that only the richest will be able to afford it, there will be a majority of society who will refuse and say, well, my grandchildren, maybe. But in the meantime, I need to continue to use the oven to cook. And we can fix that if we can make sure that our energy transition is well planned.
We got to check.
Okay, risk. We've had a look at that. Let's tick the box then. For those risks, let's move on to opportunities. I don't know whether, as the economy says, whether the ESG is those are the emptiest initials, or it's then since SOS in a lift. I think. Do you agree with that? I don't know whether you believe that. Okay, you're in the corporate world and you know it's profitable. We know the doctrine behind it all, but I want to ask you the question. There's a cynical approach to this, and I'm sorry, I'm being your sparring partner here. The cynical view on this is ESG, yes, but not like this. We need to have objective parameters. It needs to be measurable and equal for everybody. Otherwise, ESG, this benchmarking we have, is just it can suit all companies because they can end up being number one for everything. ESG, yes, no, profitable obligation, or is it just simply something that it's a cover-up? For me, it's a reality, and it's been a reality for me for years now. I think there are some facts and figures out there, and I can give you our vision if you like in a moment. Sustainability is a criterion for a long time now, has been part of international investors' interest in criteria. I think it was Bloomberg that brought out an estimate, and they said that by 2025 there would be ESG-related investments of I think it was $53 trillion in assets. I mean, that's almost the world's economy. So it's a value, it's an investment criterion. In Redea, we have been tracking over recent years our own shareholding compositions and what percentage are shareholders that are there because of ESG-related criteria. Last year, we came up with the figure that almost 50%, 47% exactly, are ESG-related funds. Now, 3 years ago, that figure was only 30%. So we are seeing this with our own eyes. We're seeing what it means to invest in green bonds, and we know that there are certain investors that are asking for this. We know it's cheaper as well. These are both facts of life. So for us, it is a criterion that contributes value. The market attaches more and more value to it. And these are the facts of life. Maybe that idea that you're saying here, with that approach that years ago that sustainability didn't contribute value to companies was right, but it's not like that now. That is our experience. It's quite the opposite. You have 82 out of 100 in Standard & Poor's rating, but are the indicators or are the measurements the same for everybody? How can you all be number one in sustainability as electricity companies? Shouldn't there be a number two somewhere? Are they credible? Apart from the metrics themselves, which are fine, you have to see what's behind the metrics. How an organization looks and changes a whole corporate culture to steer it in the direction of those criteria. I think we have to be acknowledged for the work we're doing, but the important thing is everything else. Every single employee in Redea, when taking a decision, has to think about these ideas, and that's how you generate a culture of sustainability in the group. I think we're doing that. Last Tuesday, the chairwoman announced a sustainability plan, which is very likely to be approved by the next board meeting, with 80-something indicators that we have to deliver on. These are metrics; these are real indicators that we have to meet, and the rest is another matter. Roberta, every time we actually meet in a forum, and you always say the same, and Roberta, you and Enegas, you say the same. You talk about metrics, so it's metrics and money, though, isn't it? 2.7 billion euros is what you've invested for decarbonization already. So there's money in this, and there's also commitment investment in this. So let me ask exactly the same question: is this feasible? Does it contribute value? Or is it just empty? Questionable. Is it just a cover-up? Well, 2.7 million euros is not a cover-up. Well, it's an expensive one, yes. What we all have to understand is how the energy system will evolve over time. The energy system, over time, will reduce its reliance on carbon. It'll be less carbon intensive, and we will get to that reality of net zero emissions. So how will that look in the gas sector? Slowly and surely, phasing in, we will replace a fossil gas, which still has a key role to play right now in Europe today. We're still experiencing that, and it's dramatic, isn't it, what we're seeing? We have to actually, we still have to replace the 150 million cubic meters of Russian gas by other replacement gases, renewable gases, whatever. So yes, of course, it's gas still has a role to play to ensure that we still have prosperity and we still have freedom, but at the same time, we gradually have to face in the replacement of the fossil-based gas with renewable energies, basically biomethane and renewable hydrogen, as well as gases that can be the vectors for renewable hydrogen. We could have renewable methanol, for instance. And that's the other side of the coin in decarbonisation, electrification. We're moving towards a world where renewables and electrification will be the response to the need to achieve the net zero emission target, and will require investment because we will have to build new infrastructures. We will have to make this transition possible. Well, Javier, that is the reality that we're facing today. And when you are an investor and you want to venture your money, you want to be absolutely sure that you're giving your money to companies that have accepted and taken on board those challenges of the future. Otherwise, you're going to find that your investment will end up being stranded assets because the companies that you've invested in have taken the wrong decisions. So those investments will ensure that the energy transition will actually take place, and we will have decarbonisation hand in hand with security of supply. But is that an opportunity for you? If we're looking at the interim phase there, is it a way of attracting cheaper capital? Today, Roberto has mentioned this, and those of us in the infrastructure world for decarbonisation, we have similar levels of ESG investment. As I said, today, as things stand, if you don't fully take on board this challenge of sustainability, you will be left on the sidelines. You'll be outside the investment portfolio. You will not get the money that is available for those infrastructures in the world. And when we do the roadshows, as they're called, basically we try to convince investors to invest in us, to trust us. Investors more and more are attaching more importance to our commitment or your commitment to sustainability. So it's not just some pretty label that we're sticking on the company. It's something that is in our DNA, and it's another way of getting the financing that we need and the capital we need. We were talking about the green hydrogen before. The Repower EU plan says that this is necessary, that we need to drive those hydrogen infrastructures much more. The figures that they're looking at are 20 million tons of hydrogen in imports and transport between now and 2030. And there's a criticism about this. It's going too slowly. Do you agree with that? Do you think the mindset has changed? And what opportunities do you see there? How do you see that after what we've heard today in the news? Well, we quite clearly see hydrogen. And I'm saying hydrogen overall. I mean, green hydrogen is the ideal form of hydrogen, but there are lots of different hydrogens of different colors, and different countries have chosen different colors, pink or gray hydrogen. But hydrogen in general is a magnificent opportunity for us. In Spain, green hydrogen is very important because most of the costs of producing hydrogen come from the cost of electricity generation. As we are a country where the sun shines, and then we can generate that electricity much more cheaply than other countries. It's true that, as you said, in Germany, they're saying, oh, let's make the most of sun over there and generate green hydrogen and see how we can transport it. So we, as companies that build infrastructure, CLH, Enegas, we build pipelines. In our case, it's liquid that goes through those pipelines, but we could also channel gas through them. So there will be some real opportunities out there for us. Could we ever get to some magic figure It sounds like I'm the one there that is a bit of a party pooper here, because I'm always saying that there are some difficulties, but one is coordination that we need. There are lots of technologies, hydrolyzers, and we need to know what's going to happen. We know that we will end up getting to green hydrogen, but what we don't know whether it will be a beta or how it will be. So there is a certain amount of technological uncertainty surrounding this, about the winning technology that will come into play and bring down the costs even more. The way things stand today, the production of green hydrogen is very expensive. And so when you have an energy vector that is 4 or 5 times more expensive as others, then what you do to be able to attain the target, we will need everything to come together. The politics and the public sector link, the possibility of getting subsidies, just as they did for solar power, wind power, and not just subsidies for generators for consumers. And the money is important, yes, but I don't think we're missing that now. What we're missing in society is for the public institutions to basically get everybody in order and in place. In California, remember, they had a tremendous amount of pollution in San Francisco and other cities. And what did they do? They wanted more hydrogen-propelled cars, and as a natural process, this would never have happened. But the local government decided that it wouldn't just provide the money for this to happen, it would also actually create the sequence. And it said, we need cars, and it talked to all of the manufacturers, so it chose a couple of them. So we also need service stations where they can fill up with hydrogen. That was the next thing, and also demand. So they put together a plan which is, I think, an example for us. There are more hydrogen-propelled cars in the streets of San Francisco than anywhere else. And I think we need to do something simple. We want to hit the figures by 2030. I love that sentence. You said we're not lacking money. It's order that we need. No, there you go. I'm a mathematician for you, aren't I? Order, numbers. One thing goes before the next thing. Everything has to be done in the right order. Let me finish off with the last question. I don't know whether I can be more cynical than I've been up to now. There's not much left there. But what about the war? That's another factor. We've just skimmed through that. Give me your thoughts about that to finish off this panel. How will it change things? How will it influence things? If there will be a change, if we're looking at the long-term goal of sustainability, how will it influence? How will it change all of this? The three of you, could you give the answer?
Well, I think the war has been a shock. It has shaken us awake from a dream, and we've realized that we're already late in this energy transition. Unfortunately, we've had to find out in this traumatic way with a war, but it's woken us to a reality, which is that the energy transition is more needed than ever, and we need it faster. And we will experience the consequences of this delay and of this war for many months. I hope as few as possible. But the message is that it has awakened us to a hard reality, which is that we have to accelerate this transition. Arturo or Rosa, it doesn't matter. Well, I think clearly we will be getting to 2050 and achieving those targets. And maybe, as Heather said, short term, we might have small blips which we will have to correct, because we cannot leave part of the population without heating, or a company shutting its doors because it can't afford to continue operating due to energy prices. But these would just be temporary corrections which we will make without forgetting that the end is in sight, and that is reaching a zero net emission society by 2050. Arturo, well, I think that what the war has taught us, or is teaching us very painfully, is first that security of supply, which we took as a given, is not. And so we have to think again about guaranteeing supply. And that requires three things, in my view. First, to plan and invest in infrastructures. Secondly, to do so with a European perspective. We need a European and more integrated energy system. And in Power EU is, to a large extent, the framework for that European energy policy we didn't have when we should have had it. And so, second, a European perspective based on solidarity and integration. And thirdly, the most secure resource in terms of guaranteeing supply is local. And so we have to trust in renewable energies to generate locally and generate the electricity and the hydrogen that will be the basis for our future energy system. But we have to be aware of the fact that in this, Spain has tremendous opportunities, and with everyone's effort, we could position ourselves strategically in a way which can contribute to our industrial development and prosperity in the next years. Okay, the CEO of Enagas, Arturo Gonzalo, Rosa García, Chairwoman of Exelum, and Roberto García, CEO of Redella. Thank you very much. Thank you for answering so skillfully. Those well-established executives that you are. Thank you very much.
Si se están incorporando.
We are now, if you're connecting now, you should know what we've been doing and what's ahead. We've spoken about general principles and ethics and general matters. We've spoken about policies and about the long-term perspective. And we've heard the different actors, both the new and the most consolidated actors in this field. And now, of course, we still have to talk about regulations. And today we have some very major guests indeed. I'm now going to introduce the Governor of the Bank of Spain, Pablo Hernández de Cos. Governor, welcome.
Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Javier. It's always difficult to speak after Javier. He's got such a wonderful voice. But I'll try and do my best. Thank you very much, Beatriz. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this conference. And I'm going to talk in the 20 minutes that you've so kindly assigned to me. I'm going to talk about something which might surprise you, which is inequality. Social sustainability is one of the three themes that you've been talking about these 3 days, the conference. And the Bank of Spain has been spending a lot of time on the environmental part of things for various reasons, climate change, the fight against climate change, of course, impacts our monetary policy. Clearly, a lot of the decisions that are needed in the fight against climate change will affect inflation, which is the essential mandate of a central bank and of the ECB. And that's why we're very focused on that analysis. As the supervisor, clearly physical risks, climate risks, and the risks of the climate transition generate financial risks for the banking sector. And so as supervisors and regulators of that sector, we have to analyze and compel banks, or require that the banks and the financial sector overall take those risks into account in their statements and in their operations. And governance is also, I think, an essential part of a supervisor's mandate in terms of ensuring that the banking sector has appropriate governance. Also, when establishing capital ratios, you must have the right governance schemes, and if you don't have them, that has implications on capital requirements, but even more so for an independent institution like a central bank, like the Bank of Spain or the ECB. A very important part of the independence of that institution has to do with its institutional framework and therefore with its governance framework. And I've spoken at different times about this matter, but perhaps I've spoken less often on the topic at hand, which is social sustainability. And that's a topic that we all know is extremely relevant, independently of any political and social considerations which surround this issue, particularly inequality, which is a topic that I want to discuss. Because I think today we have sufficient evidence that beyond the usual trade-off, which will always exist between inequality and efficiency, economists now have quite solid empirical evidence which shows that above a certain level of inequality, that trade-off no longer exists, in the sense that excessive inequality means less economic growth. And that point is why a lot of institutions, which you never would have expected to spend time doing research and analysis on inequality, have been doing so in the last years. And I'm referring to international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, but also central banks and the Bank of Spain. And the Bank of Spain published just a few years ago a report which I think has one of the best analysis, I'm not going to say the best, but one of the best analysis on the trends in inequality in Spain. And within the context of this conference, and since it has this social component, I think that it could help to demonstrate the importance of this phenomenon also in the private sector. It's not just for the public sector. And so what I'm going to do is to refer to 10 facts which I hope will motivate potential future action by the private sector. And I've not drafted these. These are by in a book by published by Olivier Blanchard and Daniel Roderick, in which they have compiled some of the most up-to-date analysis on inequality. And I think it's on chapter 1 or chapter 2, I don't remember exactly, where Lucas Chancel makes a description of the 10 facts that we know about inequality, and I'm going to revisit those, but I will be introducing some elements which apply specifically to Spain's economy. And the first, which might be of least interest to you, but I'm going to put it first because I think it's absolutely crucial, and that is that we don't have enough information. The data we have now to analyze inequality are still clearly insufficient. And any analysis needs quality data. And so that's the first message that Lucas Chancel has included in that list of 10 facts. If we want to assess what we have, we need quality data. And so we need to invest in good statistics. And globally, it's true that there's been an initiative, the World Inequality Database, which is the seminal database that is now being used to document, assess, and analyze inequality around the world. But actually here, the Bank of Spain has a survey, the Household Financial Survey, which we've been carrying out since 2002. And that is very relevant for a lot of topics for the Bank of Spain, in our financial analysis of households. But it also has another crucial element, and that is that the greatest difficulty when creating a database on inequalities, that it's really difficult to determine the level of income and wealth of the richest. And for that, statistically, you have to oversample the rich so that you can actually have sufficient information in order to do that analysis. And in the Bank of Spain, I think we have one of the best, if not the best, team of statisticians and economists studying this matter. And from the start, back in 2000, when that decision was made, and in the first survey in 2002, that was an essential component, oversampling the rich so that we could also analyze these types of topics. And I'd like to publicly thank the tax authorities and the Institute of Tax Research, who've done a lot of work in this area. But first message is inequality data is scarce. We need to continue to invest, and we need to make it available to researchers so that we can continue to learn about this important issue. And the next point, that currently we know that global inequality, unlike what you might think, has decreased. But the breakdown is important. It's come down globally, but it's increased individually in a lot of countries. So there's sort of two trends, two opposing trends. On the one hand, inequality between countries measured in terms of the differences in mean per capita income, for example, have decreased as a result of the convergence between a lot of emerging economies, and that has reduced that inequality globally. But that process has taken place in parallel with an increase in the inequality in per capita income within countries, even in the developed countries. And I'd like to put it differently. Let's think just of the US. In the US, the 10th poorest percentile of the population in 1980 corresponded to the 60th percentile of wealth distribution globally. Today, that 10th percentile corresponds with percentile 40. So the difference has decreased in relative terms. So globally, there's less inequality, but very probably, and that's what we know when we look at the details, in the case of the US and other countries, there's actually been an increase in inequality within the country itself. And of course, people have tried to explain this in different ways. Think of globalization, technology change, which has enabled companies to offshore some of their operations to emerging countries and developing countries, but also an increase in the degree of concentration, which has reduced competition levels and probably also the negotiating capacity of workers for wages. Thirdly, revenue inequality has increased in most countries since the 80s, although at different speeds. And I'm going to give some details now. In Spain, however, it has remained stable. In Spain, perhaps the most important point is that inequality in income has a very pro-cyclic component, or counter-cyclic rather. It increases during recessions and it decreases during growth periods, because traditionally, and perhaps the only exception was this last crisis with the pandemic, high volatility in employment, with unemployment rates increasing a lot more than in other countries during recessions, and the biggest driver of inequality is therefore unemployment, which is then corrected very quickly also when there's economic recovery. And let me just give you a few numbers. And here we have some information from even a century ago for some economies like the US, for example, or the UK.
Por ejemplo,
If we look at 1% of the wealthiest with the highest income, just a century ago, this was about 20% of national revenue or national income. Then that figure fell progressively until close to 7%, or 10% in the case of the US, 7% in the UK. That was in the 1980s. Nevertheless, and subsequent to those dates, the level of inequality has risen again. So that percentage, that the percentage accounted for by the rich is up to 30% in the UK, 90% in the US. If we want to just concentrate on the 1% wealthiest, but also look at the lower side of distribution, and we look at 50%, the 50% of the poorest people. Once again, look at the data. They're eloquent. 1980, the total income of the 50% of the lowest income, that was 20% in Western Europe and 20% in the US. And in the 40 years following that, that figure fell by 2 percentage points in Europe and 6 percentage points in the United States. In Spain, which is an exception, so remember I said, because of the fluctuation in employment and unemployment, we've seen that the 50%, the lower side of the distribution was 20% in 1918, 21%, 40 years after that. So there was just a very, very slight increase, but pretty negligible, actually. The fourth element in my diagnosis, in this case, an increase in the net private wealth rate, which has gone up, and a reduction in the case of the public sector. Analysts aren't just looking at the fundamentals of wealth there in the private sector. They're looking at the assets that may be held in the private sector and the public sector, and also the total number of assets in the economy. We've seen that the proportion of net public wealth has fallen because of this higher debt levels. We've seen that in so many economies today, plus the disposal of many different shares in public companies. This has happened in a lot of countries, and that is why the private sector portion has significantly increased. The fifth important aspect, which may be the one that people are paying most attention to, is the increase in the concentration of private wealth. I'm not talking about income here. I'm not talking about the inflow of money here. I'm looking at wealth as it's being held. And that is the case particularly of the US. In Europe and in Spain, well, yes, too. There are two key elements. It has risen less and the level of concentration is lower. That is because the inequality is less than we are experiencing in the US. So let me give you some figures once again. Participation in the case of total private wealth in the economy of the 1% richest in the US, that has increased since 25% in the 1980s to 35%. That is the figure today. That is 10% up. It's a significant increase in the US. In Spain's case, the figure was 22% back then, and it's now 24%, with differences in statistics. I'm trying to use, for comparative purposes, the same database for a like-to-like explanation. But when we look at the Bank of Spain, and I did say this earlier on in my presentation, if we look at the figures, then there is a more significant increase there in the figures. That is why I'm emphasizing the very first point that I made, the need to continue to invest in statistics if we want to have the right documentation to back up what we're saying. The sixth aspect is true that in parallel that wealth has risen, but if we solely and exclusively look at the last decade, there seems to have been a stabilization of figures. Once again, if we look at the Spanish economy and we use the international database again, we can see that 1% weight of the greatest level of wealth there hasn't really varied over the last 10 years. There are some interesting analyses that are made in that publication that I was talking about earlier on that was published by the Bank of Spain just a few years ago on inequalities, and that is the relationship between inequality and the rate of ownership of homes. There seems to be a correlation there between a higher ownership rate in countries that how many people own their own homes and a lower level of inequality. That is why in Spain's case there was a significant increase in inequality during the international financial crisis. Why? Because there was a significant fall in housing prices, which is the main asset that the people have, particularly in the case of lower income households. And the wealthier sector has more diversification in their wealth and their asset base, and they could perhaps offset the fall off in prices of housing during that time. The seventh aspect, which I also think is one of the most relevant ones, is the analysis of intergenerational mobility as well as intra-generational mobility. I think we would probably all agree that it's important to understand to what extent the position in wealth distribution you have is better or worse than the position that your parents were in. When you think about equalities and opportunities, I always think about whether we're moving upwards, if new generations are improving on the position that their parents were in. And it's the same case when you look at your own generation as you're starting off your professional career, if you're at the lower end of the distribution chart, then there should be mobility. You should be able to move upwards towards the high end of the distribution table. You need to have high levels of mobility between generations and within generations, so that the wealth levels should not be of any concern to us, because they will not be long-lasting, they will not persist, and there will be changes. What does literature tell us? It tells us that intergenerational mobility is the most relevant mobility to explain low levels there of inequality. When there are low levels of mobility, there are low levels of inequality, or lower levels in countries. When it's intergenerational, that correlation isn't so exact. Don't ask me why, really, because for me it seems to be counterintuitive, but that is the reality. So what can we say here about Spain's economy? Well, we can see that Spain, as in a midpoint between countries that have high levels of mobility, was essentially the Scandinavian countries, and on the other side, low mobility countries such as the United States or Italy, and I'm saying Italy because this is a country that is closest to us. And as I was saying, if you look at the correlation with levels of inequalities and intergenerational mobility, well, they're less conclusive. The intergenerational mobility measures in US have meant that this has been more static or more stable. When you look at the stability that exists there in the intergenerational mobility rates in the US, but the increase in inequality there, then it's hard to say that one is an explanation of the other. One important question is that this stability in nearly all countries of the intergenerational mobility rate conceals very different pathways there, different data for men or women. That's important. In the case of men, the intergenerational mobility rate has got worse, but it has been offset by an increase in intergenerational mobility for women, which significantly increased, and quite obviously this is related to the greater participation of women in the workplace. This has been an additional positive element and comes from gender equality in Spain. Actually, this is where the phenomenon has been most marked. If you look at the curve, it is highly positive. The eighth aspect, which is also very much linked to what I've just told you, is that the increase of participation of women in the total revenue or income of the economy has also significantly increased over recent decades. And once again, this is a case of Spain, although, of course, there is still a reduced participation of women in the top level of wealth and in income. So yes, it's true that there has been this increase of their position, the position of women, but they're still not on an equal footing with men. Absolutely not. In the case of the USA, only about 25%, a quarter of the 10% of the highest earners are women. Now, it would be 50%, of course, if it was completely equal in distribution terms, but it's only 25%. And by the way, there are similar values, similar figures in countries where you would imagine that would be in a better position, such as in the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, France, etc., are in a similar position. The ninth point, probably self-evident to you here in the audience, is about access to public education services, to health services, and also the nature of employment relations are also having an important impact on income after tax in the lower end of the distribution chart. I'd also like to talk to you, and there's a relation here. After transfers, after tax, it could be surprising to hear that US distributes a higher fraction of its income to the 50% of the poorest than any other European countries. Both facts are true in parallel. So the conclusion we could reach with these two pieces of evidence is that the differences between US and Europe in the case of inequalities, and I was talking about the difference between now and going back to the 1980s, could not necessarily be explained by factors such as globalization, technological development, which are both common, I would say, to Europe and the US, nor to wealth redistribution measures because of what I've just said. The conclusion that we can infer here is that it has a lot more to do with institutional structures and policies affecting income, household income, and after-tax income, such as public education, universal health coverage, and the money that is earned by people at the lower end of the distribution table. And the last point, I'd like to wrap up on this point, is to point out to you another piece of evidence that stems from this analysis on the causes of inequality in the description or meaning of it, is that the tax system, the way it's designed, also has a big impact on equality. But if we're to study it, you have to look at its redistribution effects, but at the same time, its pre-distributive effects. Let me just explain this to you in a minute. If you have progressive taxation on income, that this could help to reduce inequality, particularly if we're looking at the higher part of distribution. However, the impact on it after tax is less evident. Those incentives, such as for example, trade-offs. If you have a progressive income tax system, then education, that premium there to get educated, perhaps it is lower. Those trade-offs exist and have to be taken into account when you're designing taxation systems. I'd like to finish on that point. However, let me just finish off with a sentence that is optimistic, but also sounds a word of warning. It's from the 2015 economist, winner of the prizes. That the world tends to be better than that it could be. People, that's the optimistic side. People are wealthier and healthier and live longer lives. Still optimistic there. However, this warning is pulling so many people out of poverty has generated a tremendous amount of inequalities between people and countries. That was from Amartya Kumar Sen. I think that shows you the position we're in and justifies why events like this one should talk about social sustainability, at least some of the time. Thank you.
Bueno, vista.
Okay, now that we've talked about regulation and also from a rather unusual perspective for the Bank of Spain, we're going to now move on to the next regulator. We've seen the actors in general, and now we're going to see each of the regulators. So financial regulation, and this one, which is about wealth distribution and equity. So let's talk to the government. Xiana Mendez, State Secretary of Trade. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Has llegado para ser atracada directamente.
I know that you've just arrived, so we're going to open fire straight away. First, and I think I may have broken that table. Okay. We've been talking for a while about risks, opportunities. Let me ask you first and foremost, how do you see the current situation? Because we've heard something, Rosa said it before, that there have been some broken supply chains, and we've been saying that there's a bit of a change of paradigm going on, that apparently there's going to be more state intervention, bigger role for the state, and we're also started to talk about re-onshoring. Is this progress, or is this a step back? Is it a reversal of globalization? How do you see it? Well, first we have to look at the data, and it's true that with the pandemic and afterwards also because of the war in Ukraine, we have identified some vulnerabilities in supply chains. And we should remember that Spain, for example, is a country that's part of the global supply chains more than other OECD countries even. And so an impact on those chains clearly has an impact on our industry and also our foreign trade. But what we saw was, particularly during the pandemic, a very sudden impact on international trade. We'll all remember that it was strong, but it didn't last very long. By the summer of 2020, trade flows started to recover, but we still felt some of the after effects, particularly with the supply crisis and increase in the cost of freight, and also now increasing costs of products that we import in very significant quantities like commodities and energy products. And all of that, of course, affects all the value supply chains where we are integrated. And we did a study at the end of 2021, I'm going to repeat it again now, which is the Export Context Survey in Q3 of 2022 to assess the impact on exporters of these effects on supply chains. And about 70% said they were affected in some way because of the operation of their own supply chain. Some control their own supply chain and are able to make choices, but others do not have any control over the different links in that supply chain, and so they are affected most by that situation. And those who can make choices on their supply chain, on what they buy and sell, and whom they hire, and the terms and the prices, have made certain decisions. And in the survey, what they tell us is that mostly what they've decided to do is to diversify their suppliers, mostly to seek new suppliers, not to replace the old ones, but in addition to the previous ones. And a much smaller percentage, about 10%, that was 20%, 10%, replaced their current suppliers with new suppliers. And then a much smaller percentage, around 3%, have changed their value chains by shortening those supply chains. And that could be onshoring, or it could be transferring parts of the links of those chains to closer markets, which geographically or geopolitically they feel are more secure or more controllable or predictable. And if we think about decisions they're considering for the future, because we've also asked them about this, some are considering in the future, about 7.5% of them are considering in the future also reducing the length of those supply chains, but nevertheless, with 7.5%, it's still the minority. The majority, mostly what they're trying to do in order to mitigate this risk in their supply chains, is diversify sources and also increase their stocks, because that's the first action that was taken. And we believe that that's the smartest strategy. Of course, global supply chains have evolved over many years as a result of the search for efficiencies. And so any mitigation of the impacts of the war or the pandemic on that efficiency are going to have a cost. Shortening those supply chains will have a cost. Increasing the security of that chain will also have a cost. Guaranteeing the stability and the security of that chain will have a cost. And therefore, to increase security through diversification, not just by looking at geographical proximity, but also countries with whom we share values and have a stable relationship because we have a trade agreement or an investment agreement, is probably the smartest strategy to maintain efficiency, but also mitigate the effects of instability without destroying a chain, which up to now, for multiple reasons, had operated very effectively. And so the result is not re-onshoring or reversing globalization, but actually globalizing more. Instead of just having a supply in China, you will have one in China, in India, and in all the rest of Asia. Is that what's happening? Well, it's globalization, but it also considers something that was not taken into account up to now, which is to try and mitigate your vulnerabilities. Because if you lengthen when you lengthen the supply chains, thinking just of efficiency, you overlooked the element of security. And so we think it's possible to reconcile the two, to diversify and therefore still have long chains, but at the same time have supply chains that are flexible enough to switch strategies when there's a crisis. And above all, it's important also to have some control over that supply chain. You cannot just be impacted by those other links that do have the control of that chain. What Spanish companies need to do is to have some control of that supply chain so they can modify them when needed. So diversification is always, I think, not just the preferable strategy, but also the preferred strategy in view of the results of these surveys. But there are, of course, also strategic sectors, as we saw during the pandemic. And it's not the same when you're talking about manufacturing video games, although I'll remind you that last year there was a lot of worry because of delays in the deliveries of video games. But of course, it's not the same to have problems with video game deliveries than to have them with drug deliveries or basic supplies for food security, which, of course, as exporters, as leading exporters, we need basic supplies like fertilizers for that sector. And so there are products and sectors that are strategic where security is worth more than efficiency. But it's important to also let the public understand that, because it sounds as if strategic independence is cheap, and actually strategic independence is expensive because security has a price, but sometimes you have to accept that price. And what does that mean in terms of reindustrialization? Because, of course, the bright side of not trusting those long supply chains is maybe that industry could be relocalized here. And if that's not happening, what's that going to mean eventually for Spain? Well, it is happening for some sectors, and it's interesting and a positive development too. And so, for example, Spain has prioritized the automobile sector. The consequence of that is that we need to be able to have more links of that supply chain here and not be so dependent on distant markets, or markets that are geopolitically unstable. And so as a result, for example, we need to localize lithium link or battery manufacturing within our national borders, or microchip manufacturing, for example. But these are very specific cases because they're very strategic, they make sense. And in that area, we are seeing reindustrialization, and we are seeing a lot of foreign investment flow towards Spain in these priority sectors. And we're also seeing that in biotechnology. And that's a positive development as well. And for example, through Invest in Spain, what we have seen is that some of the companies that used to manufacture pretty significantly in Asian markets, like China, or mostly China, have now considered moving to countries closer to the EU, and they're focusing very much on Spain for some of their manufacturing, seeking cost efficiencies, but above all, security. And so reindustrialization is a great opportunity which is developing. And this reorganization, I wouldn't say necessarily a shortening of global supply chains. And in some strategic products, we are seeing those flows move to Spain. And you spoke about biotechnology and batteries. And there's two sides here that we need to think about for those of you who are in government. First, should this be promoted or done by the government with the PERTES and the European funds? Is this what should attract all these industries, or should this be driven by the private sector? Well, as I said before, security has a price, and therefore it will in some cases affect efficiency and margins. And so what we're doing is to internalize some of those costs of having more secure supply chains. And since these are strategic sectors, and since it's about national security, having, for example, in the case of biotechnology, drugs available, I think it does make sense to provide public incentives in order to multiply the effects of those private investments. But I think the aim itself is public good, which is guaranteeing the secure supply of strategic products. And so if there isn't enough private investment, I think it makes sense to have a system of public incentives through PERTES, for example, in this case. And the PERTES system has been much praised, and it is definitely a driver, but it's also being questioned because of some problems. Volkswagen has announced today that they might not invest in the Sagunto battery plant because there's some bureaucratic problems. And so can the government and the bureaucracy become an obstacle? Might you lose Volkswagen? Well, I don't think so. As far as I know about this PERTE, it was very carefully designed. And so I think now we should try and reconcile everyone's interests, those of the private and the public sector. And in the case of this PERTE, there's also that knock-on effect for the large auto manufacturers, international auto manufacturers whose decision-making occurs outside Spain, even though we are the first manufacturer and the second exporter in the EU. But of course, there is that knock-on effect with all the other suppliers and parts manufacturers. But that's all been included in the PERTE and in the terms and conditions, and I think it has a lot of value. So let's hope that all of these interests may be aligned. But in the meantime, I'll say that the support for electric connected vehicles in Spain make all kinds of sense for the country, but also for foreign investors, because in Spain we have every requirement for a leading electric car manufacturing sector and connected vehicles as well. That's actually something that had already been happening, and the PERTE is just giving it a boost and upscaling it. But I have no doubt that in Spain we will be manufacturing electric connected vehicles, and we will continue to be one of the leading exporters of automobiles as we have been up to now. But in this case, electric connected vehicles and batteries, of course, also. And we have lithium even. So, and we have automobile components and parts companies with tremendous international reputation, with manufacturing plants in Spain, in Europe, and in Asia, very competitive as well.
Factor.
Looking at all of this, looking at the international map, and looking at all the suppliers out there, looking at the drive of the public sector here, and what you've been talking about here, about the role of the public sector, there is something else then. Once this has all been done, what about free trade agreements? And a question that I rose before, rather cynically, and I'm going to be a cynic again here and ask you the same question. Yes, sustainability. Using clean energy to produce things, that's all a cost for me, isn't it? So I'm going to lose my competitive edge there. Is there any way of harmonizing this with those sustainability free trade agreements too? Well, I would start off with that assertion you've made. I told you that that's the cynical approach. That's the cynical view. It's my job to be cynical today. Well, if you've argued over this before, I don't need to get back into that. But I don't think sustainability can be turned as can be something that stops you being competitive, using it to negotiate. In fact, in this country, I think we are doing what we can to maximize the 2030 agenda to get the most out of it. Spanish companies are at the forefront with the funds that we're getting, but even without the funds that we are getting, we need, as a country, to be in a leading position, and the first mover will win the day. In the case of the 2030 agenda, sustainability, it is a real competitive edge that you get through that. And if I can go back to your point about trade agreements and that cynical debate, the cynical debate is, well, but it's a legitimate debate, isn't it? China can actually manufacture with much more highly polluting technologies before. I don't know. Free riders didn't come up before, but I could use that here. It means that some have to pay more, have more costs, and they have to actually lag behind, and others will be ahead for a time. So what about free trade agreements with sustainability as a condition? Yes, for a cynical reason, and yes, because of other reasons. Let me start off with the cynical reasons for it. If I'm going to be just purely cynical about this, with regard to fair competition, we would have to require other companies that are operating in other countries, if they want to get into the EU market, that they should meet the same rules or comply with the same rules that we are requiring our companies to do to meet. The European market isn't the only one, I know, but we have rules on sustainability in the broadest sense of the word, environment, social factors, all of that does, of course, entail a cost for our companies, and to a certain extent constrains the way that they can operate, because there are some conditions that impose on. And if we're going to require that from our companies, we have to do the same for companies from other countries or those third countries that we don't have agreements with if they want to get into our market. That's the cynical view on it. But under that cynical heading, if we are going to make all of this conditional on certain factors, the latest regulations of the EU on public procurement will require that any companies from third countries outside the EU will also have to comply with certain conditions that we apply here, but in their own countries. And in the World Trade Organization, the WTO, there is this view on how to promote fair competition, and the multilateral arrangements that exist will also have to take into account sustainability. If we're asking our companies to be sustainable, we'd have to ask all companies in all countries in the world to be sustainable. But this is from the approach of principles. But as the globalization and economic growth is an engine for prosperity, we've got industrialization. There could, of course, be some polluting effects of all of this, and some countries, to be able to foster trade, may also move away from international standards that have been agreed. Standards, for instance, working conditions or environmental standards, so they can manufacture more cheaply and export more. That is why sustainable development clauses should be included in such agreements, and that is because the EU is also looking for a response to those global challenges like climate change, and wants to make those answers something that we share with our trade partners. I'm not saying that a trade agreement necessarily has to include this clause about the environment. I mean, it's about trade, but you also want to mitigate any impact, because we share values and we share principles. It makes sense. It's logical. And over the years, these clauses have become more sophisticated. They used to just be a declaration of intent, but now they are something that can be applicable. You have ideas about reforestation and deforestation, following on from the Paris Accord, and then perhaps indigenous communities in the timber business, and questions related to gender equality or upholding labor standards, working conditions, and the ILO treaty as well. If that's the answer to your cynical question, then are there any metrics? Are there indicators there that can be that big companies can be asked to comply with and more easily, or is it? What about SMEs, though? I mean, if this internationalization process is moving in that direction, if we're going to ask businesses to be more sustainable, how can you measure all of this? How can you check on it? What will be the impact of international trade on small and medium-sized enterprises? I think even SMEs, if they're prepared to become more international, and Spain is a country of SMEs, France is a country of SMEs, Germany too, the difference between ours and theirs is that our SMEs are much smaller, their turnover is smaller, and the number of jobs in those SMEs is lower. But as they are SMEs, and if they are ready to go international, then they probably are familiar with the international competition, and they have probably understood sustainability issues because they know sustainability can benefit their internationalization. In the case of startups, this is something that you will see right across the board, but compliance with standards, of course, entail a cost, an administrative cost that will be higher for SMEs. So it would be good for these standards perhaps to be made flexible or to tailored to the size of SMEs. Today in the EU, there's work being done on a due diligence regulation that is all about the positive impact of companies when they're operating in the EU and also outside the EU. And the essential focus is on big companies there because they are the ones that are in a better position to develop that technology, to measure their impact and to work on contingency plans. SMEs will eventually get to that point, unquestionably. So our ambition is for SMEs to become international, to get into that loop, that virtuous loop, so that it can grow by being international and more competitive. So they need to actually grow to the optimal size, but they need to also integrate sustainability in their way of doing business. And this is the last question for you, to be able to get uniform metrics for all. We've talked about this quite a lot already during this session. What we have now are they're not very strict, shall we say. They don't really work for everyone. What about putting them in for the whole chain of values, for noise, that those companies that have audits have to be done? Can you get uniform accreditation or metrics right from big companies to the small ones? There has to be an agreement on all of those different metrics, and that the EU is working on a taxonomy of them, but it's all new. And if I could just talk about what comes under my scope in Cofidis, and Cofidis is an institution attached to our Secretariat of State for Trade, which supports internationalization for companies through highly innovative instruments. And that's great because we can perhaps also take up a stake in these companies. And so there are different discounts that can be offered, and depending on the positive impact of the company's business. One of the programs which is EU funded with the Next Generation EU funds, is about that positive impact. It means that for small and medium-sized enterprises, there can be funding, not for big companies, those impact studies and methodology studies that they will need so they can understand what impact their business will have, and they will also be able to measure their effects. And all of this can be funded or co-funded through Cofidis, that institution that specifically deals with SMEs, and also through the ISEX, the Foreign Trade Institute, and ISO. We're also working with the Next Generation EU funds this is for next year. It will work on it now, but it will probably be in force next year if we're realistic. It's all about certification in due diligence. So that money will be earmarked for small and medium-sized enterprises so that we can put together some sort of nationwide certification, working with the UN in this, with the compact, the Global Compact, to ensure our certificate can be validated in other countries. We're pioneers here. Not all countries have got this. So we've stepped in first there. But we want the certificates to be equally valid outside of Spain. And they are on measuring sustainability and the impact of companies. So I think eventually we will move towards a more or less common methodology, as you've been talking about, in the whole chain of value, which will be agreed on and will be shared and will be transparent and will be honest. And that is the main issue. It should be an honest one. Well, Xiana Mendez, Secretary of State for Commerce Trade here in Spain, thank you.
les
And actually, regulators who were on the agenda for today are the ones that you've just seen and heard. We've heard the financial regulator, governor of the Bank of Spain. We've heard about trade policies from the State Secretary of Commerce. And now we're going to hear about a crucial level, of course, which is that of the European Commission. And so actually we have a small problem now because the European Commission is having problems connecting. It seems that investing in R&D and online technologies is having a problem. Perhaps we should have a 5-minute break and see if they can connect. No? Oh, they're here. Okay, they've managed to connect. Okay. So forget everything I've just said. Third level, the European level. Let me just greet Beatriz Jordi, who's Director of Carbon Markets and Clean Mobility of the European Commission. Hello, Beatriz. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And I'm sorry to have scared you with our connection difficulties. That's actually quite a good thing because people realize just how difficult it is to organize all of these events and have them run smoothly. Go ahead, Beatriz. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm really sorry to not be able to be there in person because in Brussels we're currently extremely busy with the Top 55 and the whole climate package. And so I'll start by saying a bit about COP. Yes, please go ahead. Because you have COP27 in just a few days or weeks? Few days, yeah, it's in a few days, in a week. A week. It's a week from now. Well, 2 weeks. 2 weeks from now. It starts on the 7th. I don't even know how long that is. Yeah, but it's there, around the corner. And so what's on your agenda? Tell us. Well, I'd just like to give you a bit of context about these COP summits because the other day I heard somebody on Spanish radio saying there still has to be a COP27 as the COP26 hadn't achieved anything. But actually COPs are annual conferences. They're the major conferences on climate change. And there will be another next year and there will be one every year because there's so much to do. And the last one in Glasgow raised a lot of expectations on increased action and ambition and these terrible food and energy crisis that we are experiencing because of the Ukraine invasion has dashed some of those expectations. But we keep moving forward, and some policies, perhaps some have tried to temporarily shift those policies, but no, European policies are still moving in the same direction towards decarbonization, towards a completely decarbonized economy by 2050. And the latest scientific findings, plus the drought and the extreme temperatures and the floods, all these extreme climate events have shown how vulnerable we are. I know that you've been speaking about risks, and climate change is clearly all about risks. And so in the COP, what we hope to do is to continue to provide the political boost to keep that 1.5-degree target there, to demand more ambition. It's this next COP, I would say, is going to be about showing your homework. It's a COP where the EU will present this huge climate package that we've been working on day and night with all the countries in the European Parliament. And all of these 14 policies that we have presented to Parliament and to the Council. And so it's all about showing our homework has been done. And we are expecting everyone to be presenting their homework at Sharm el-Sheikh in a couple of weeks. Everyone, rich and poor, vulnerable, not. We want to hear about what's been done, what's not been done. An important message. Energy security will not be achieved at the expense of climate action. That's something that a lot of countries agree on, definitely the EU, but also many other countries. We're also going to be focusing on adaptation and funding in this COP. It was agreed that 100 billion would be needed to invest in developing countries, and Europe, of course, including Spain, but Europe is the biggest donor. And we are at almost, the EU and the member states, $27 billion, about 23 billion euros. Adaptation, in the COPs, there's the two sides, mitigation to reduce emissions and adaptation to adapt to what's already happened to these extreme climate events. So adaptation is going to play a big role, funding, but also when speaking about finance, there's significant amounts of public funding. In the EU budget, we're going to see, I think, 28 billion euros. That's taxpayers' money, and also the private funding is going to have a lot of importance. So it's about showing that you've done your homework. It's about increasing our ambition and demonstrating that we're not going to flag on this effort and that energy security requires decarbonization no matter what. Well, Beatriz, I'm not going to say anything about what you were listening to on the radio, which radio station it was. I won't comment on that. It wasn't a good one, I have to say. But as for the war, do we feel that the war could be an obstacle, or do you think that those targets are going to be met in spite of the war? The war has actually had two sides to it, but one of it clearly has been to increase awareness. Of course, the need to protect vulnerable consumers, to fight energy poverty in Spain, in Belgium, and everywhere. For people in economic difficulties, prices are now unaffordable. And so there has been a reaction from most governments in order to protect consumers. But at the same time, I think it has also been a real slap in the face for those who felt that we should move away from the debate on climate change and focus on the serious matters, forget about frivolities and focus on serious matters. But actually what's happened is the opposite. We have seen this repower package, 20 billion plus injections of enormous investments in renewables, in green hydrogen this afternoon, as you know, thanks to that agreement between Portugal, France and Spain. And so we are seeing a tremendous boost to investments in renewables and in a better future, not just for climate change, but also because the Green Deal package could, and we know it's a huge effort, but it could reduce our gas imports by 100 billion cubic meters. And so security of supply is a factor which everybody knows that renewables and green hydrogen are the way to achieve our energy independence. And so we're talking about COP27 and about the war, whether it's an obstacle or not, for decarbonization. But one last question about the carbon markets, because that's something that some are now questioning and saying that that's a mechanism which is not just not bringing about reductions in emissions, but it's actually causing trafficking in emissions, which could be counterproductive. Emission rights, rather, that could be counterproductive. What does the Commission say about this? Well, I think our President has been very firm. At this time of crisis with a war and tremendous instability, to say that we are going to eliminate those signals in the market that will promote investment in renewables would be ridiculous. What the ETS, or the carbon trading system, does is the polluter pay principle is embedded in all financial flows, and it's a way to move forward with decarbonization. So in ETS, just to give you a bit of context, carbon prices this year represent 6% of electricity prices. And so those voices screaming that it's actually a lot more, that's only true in countries like Poland, where the percentage of coal is so high. It's 60%, but we're talking about market prices, not about end consumer prices. So countries like Poland, which consume a lot of coal, it's 20% of the market price, ETS. And if we compare what's happened with prices since January 2022, the increase of the price of gas on electricity prices is 20 times greater than that of carbon rights. So really the crisis has to do with gas prices and not with carbon markets. And so we're not going to change anything. Actually, what we need to do now is to move away from our dependence on fossil fuels. And that's why we have this proposal to extend the ETS to sectors like building or transportation and maritime sector. Plus, markets, apart from having to reduce, well, the goal is to reduce emissions year on year, but they also generate a lot of money because the polluter pays. And that goes to the member states. Last year, the ETS collected over 30 billion euros. And those 30 billion euros, most of it, 70%, has been invested in heat pumps, renewable energies, public transport. So all that money will help to reduce that dependence. And there's another part, and that's another 2 points I'd like to make. The design of carbon emission markets, you can design them, and that's what Europe has done. And it can always be done better, but it's all about innovation, about how that money can be invested in innovation. And we've created an innovation fund. And then the final very important point, and that is that what's being discussed right here next door in the Council and the Parliament is that 70 billion euros. These are pretty staggering figures, but that's what this generates. The new ETS, the one for buildings and transportation, should be used for the protection of vulnerable citizens, for the poorest citizens. And let me tell you, Javier, that 20% of the wealthiest European citizens are responsible for over 30% of the emissions. And the 20% poorest citizens in Europe are responsible for 9% of the emissions. And so there should be a flow of money from the wealthier, more polluting citizens to the most vulnerable citizens. And it's that element of solidarity in the carbon markets that is also really important in the current debate on high prices and decarbonization. Let me repeat those numbers because I hadn't heard those, in case some journalists are actually still listening. 20% of the wealthiest population generate 30% of the emissions, 32% of the emissions. And the 20% poorest, only 9, exactly. Exactly. Thank you, Beatriz. Thank you for being here and for making it on time. Thank you for joining us, the Carbon Markets Director of the European Commission, Beatriz. Jordi, thank you very much. Thank you.
Una Beatriz más.
Well, we have another Beatriz. We've said goodbye to one, and let me bring on Beatriz Corredor, who is the chairperson of Redeia. And I think this will be the conclusion. Yes, it's getting late. Yes, it's been an intense afternoon. Well, after hearing from Beatriz, another Beatriz, and hearing everything everybody said, well, I'm a bit embarrassed to be after doing this here, but let me start off with at the end. Don't go yet, because after I finish speaking, there's a show for you. There's a group that we're playing, and you'll be able to stay on and chat and join us for a snack and a drink. So that being said, let me start off by saying thank yous to everyone. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to all speakers who have been here and those who have joined us from abroad. Heather, particularly to you, thank you. Thank you to the moderators. The moderator presenters, such as Javier, who have helped us to get through all the sessions. Thank you to the technical team here, Redeia's technical team, who have done what they have can to make it possible for us to be here and to be live and streaming. We've had bottles of water here. We've got microphones when we need microphones, and everybody is in where they have to be when they arrive. That's a wonderful coordination team. Thank you to the institutional brand communication team. Thank you to the board members and the CEO and to the managers here in Redeia. Thank you to all of you working for Redeia who've supported us. Thank you to the attendees, participants here live, and to you attendees online. And thank you to the the institution that's given us this facility, and thank you to the media that they have been able to broadcast this signal. I've got the governor of the Bank of Spain here with us and the Secretary of State for Trade, so thank you to both of you here. Let me say that in person. We have talked about the crucial, dreadful circumstances that the world is in a minute about Spain as too. And the very first words we heard is in this event was the only permanent thing is change. Transformation is the key word. And when we talk about sustainability, a lot of those who probably read through our program thought, they're going to talk to a philosopher, a filmmaker, and people about ethics, and then someone is going to come along from the European Union to tell us about geopolitics. And when is Renee going to speak? When is Beatrice going to speak? Well, we try not to, because we talk all the time at our board meetings. So we wanted to actually open up and bring in people from further afield, and that helps all of us. And I have learned so much. I've learned new ways of looking at the world. I've heard about new insights and perspectives that I hadn't thought about it, and I see they will work for our bottom line, won't you? And it's not just the economic bottom line we need to work on; it's the social bottom line. Governor, to get the governor of the Bank of Spain come along to talk about sustainability and inequality, I think that is a paradigm shift. The other day, I asked you, and by the way, you concluded with some words from Diego. Diego was here representing Emilio Ontiveros, and you probably agree with what he said. He said that inequality is not profitable, and I think that has been the underlying premise of many conversations we've had today, and you've developed that brilliantly, haven't you, Governor? We always organise this event surrounding ESG, and we started on Monday. No, it wasn't Monday. It was Tuesday, wasn't it, the very first day? And we started talking about nature and the new economy, linking up two words that are usually considered to be incompatible, as Gianna was saying. To be efficient, to be sustainable, sometimes is looked at as a cost. We talked about the nature and the new economy. We talked about how the energy transition and conservation of biodiversity are essential, and how climate change and biodiversity are two sides of the same coin, and you can't talk about one without mentioning the other, and how all of this impacts the economy. We also talked about something that we've all perceived, those of us who work in the infrastructure world in particular, and that is a growing opposition, a part of public opinion to infrastructures for renewable energies. And we heard about the fact that electrons are not transmitted by Wi-Fi. That was one of the big European experts said, and Asanella said, if we don't have infrastructures there for renewables to be incorporated into the grid, there won't be self-consumption, and they are compatible. We also talked about the scientific dimension of biodiversity and our impact on the vulnerability and the delicate nature of ecosystems, how when you touch one tiny part of the ecosystem, there is a knock-on effect on the whole system. We also talked about young people and how, remember those 4 wonderful young girls that we talked to, that they were 12, 15, 18 and 24 years old, and they have picked up where we've left off, and they've said, you're doing this terribly, you older generation, we're going to do this. And there were girls, they're right, our generation haven't done things right, and they will have to turn things around. It's quite, because they will have to deal with climate change in 30 years' time. We've heard scientists tell us that no matter what we do over the next 30 years, this path is one we can't go back on. So if you have to look at the SDGs, you have to see the impact that we will have on the climate in 30 years' time. It may not affect us, but those young girls who banged us on the head and said we have to do something will live to see it. We also talked about investment and investors and how more and more they're taking seriously sustainability, and there's a lack of metrics and international standards, as you said, to be able to really score whether they are sustainable as companies. Greenwashing, social washing has also been talked about, and green bonds. That was day one. We also talked about miracles there. Fernando Valladares told us that he didn't believe in miracles, and he said that efficiency, economy and politics work miracles, but he did remind us of something that from a philosophical position, essential, that is utopia. The utopian idea that to move the world, we have to consume less, he said. And he questioned the dogma of the infinite economic growth, dear governor. So I thought he was being provocative, but it was quite relevant because I think the vision of utopia matters too. Then yesterday we started to talk about people and culture. We talked about the sovereignty of imagination and creativity and how people and individuals are important to be able to conserve humankind literally in these times of crisis. And we talked about solidarity. The conversation yesterday, I felt, was terribly inspirational. We talked about the gap between things that are intangible. We talked about what is intrinsically human in us, and we talked about creativity, imagination. We talked lots about education because we had the Minister of Education with us from Spain yesterday. We talked about how we have to tailor the education system to an unknown labour market. 50% of the jobs that we'll have in the future, we don't know what they are, and how we need to train the young people so that they can gradually adapt their skills to fields that we're ignorant of, how to offer that flexibility, especially pay more attention to vocational training because the labour market is asking for experts in areas that we're not familiar with. And we talked about continuous vocational training too. We said to the girls, you know, that all of this business of studying and then going out to get a job and that's it. That's not the case. You will have to continue to go back to training. You missed yesterday, if you weren't here, the awards for Red STEM that we gave yesterday. You know me. I have to tell the whole story about these things. Last year in September, 4 young girls from a school in Madrid who about 14-year-old wrote to us and said that they were in a competition for the European Space Agencies and they had to work on a launcher for satellites, and they knew that Hispasat belonged to us, and they said, can we have 500 euros to buy some material for our project? And we thought it was such a great idea. We talked to the school to see how we could fund this, and the whole idea took off. We thought about coming up with a competition for that particular year, academic year. These are sort of 14-year-old girls, and they were trying to decide whether to stay on in technology and science. And we put this together in 6 months' time. More than 100 girls, 26 schools from all different regions in Spain put in their projects to the competition. We had to choose 2 of the projects for each of the categories. We had electricity, sustainability, and telecommunications. And the girls hopefully will continue to work on science, and it will be stuck with them forever. Yesterday too, we were able to listen to the president of the CNMC, the Competition Commission governor. She also talked about competition helping consumers. She talked about the energy sector and how competitiveness matters and how we need to get those interconnections with the rest of Europe. We also talked about the business world and how people are the core of the future, they're the heart of the future as we move forward. We heard from our board member how we actually bring this down to the ground and we finished off with a conversation. It was fascinating between Anton Costas and Cristina Gomendia, and whether or not we are innovative, or whether we are up there at the top. And Cristina said something, let's see if I can remember exactly what she said. She said innovation requires a change, not necessarily technological change, through know-how, not necessarily through scientific know-how, and it generates value, but not always economic value. And I think that is a wonderful definition of innovation. Innovation isn't just about being scientific, economic, and technological. And she concluded that we are a deeply innovative country if you look at innovation in that way. And today, of course, as you know, we've talked about governance, local, regional, national, and global. We've talked to Adela Cortina. Enrica Juliana talked to her about peace, about perpetual peace, the Kant's idea, and how you could only achieve that by rolling out democracy to all other countries in a cosmopolitan fashion. And the risk is that we go backward through populism, localism, nationalism, and autocracies. I don't think I need to go on about that. It's quite obvious that we are really moving away, and it's quite dangerous from liberal values. We also talked to the innovators, those entrepreneurs, not of the future, but already in the present, with those wonderful ideas, such as Max Martinez's idea for connectivity in rural areas, our friends from Mendigia, who are helping those people who are going to rescue other people to be rescued as well. And we also heard about the Hyperloop project, which is being driven by Spain to stratospheric limits. And we also, the consolidated companies, and these are the three companies, Redea, Energas, and we also have Rosa Exelum. So the TSOs, she's both Rosa Exelum is hydrocarbons. They have also a lot to say, and Javier took advantage of the news on energy today to ask some good questions. I think we got a very good picture of why we need interconnections as well as for future hydrogen. And Rosa's told me that at the past governor. I can't define what you said at all. You talked about inequality and how it's not profitable, and we have to realign public policies to ensure we don't get the inequality. I thought, we know we have that European model. I think that was a very hope. That filled me with hope. It's unique in the world. We talked about Europe a lot, and that is one of the questions that's important. I think the financial crisis of 2008 and the Ukraine crisis are showing us that there's a problem. Is there a new economic paradigm? I asked Diego the other day that, and he said yes. Will the state intervene? You have to have as much data as you need and as much market as possible is one of those sayings. And the state is no longer anathema for classic writers. I'm saying very risky things here, and the government of Spain is looking. The Bank of Spain is looking at me like that. And we've talked about the value chains and how the world's economy is being spread out or distributed through relocation. And reglobalization. Heather's talked to us about her essential work that governance in the world and geopolitical and economic and energy trends in the world, and how the energy system has an impact. It influences the life of citizens in Europe. And you've told us about your report. I've got the QR code, and I will look at that and how vulnerable consumers and common citizens will be impacted by the energy transition. What can I say about what the Beatrice who spoke before me has said? I think that was really the icing on the cake, wasn't it? Just one thing I would like to repeat, that she said that energy transition will not be achieved without the climate change reaction. We have to have the technological transition. We will have to go to energy sources that will allow us to get through the winter, and the most vulnerable consumers in Europe won't suffer. Although we're in a privileged position, aren't we, here in Spain, for energy, we have to have renewables behind the ecological transition. I would hope that the winter that is coming won't be so severe for all of us. And thank you so much. And we will have a third version of this event next year. And I will give the floor straight away to the wonderful musicians that are going to surprise you with their talent and the singer's voice. Thank you.
Mientras hacéis esto, a partir de aquí.
So I'm a financial journalist, but I'm being asked to be DJ here and introduce you to the group here. So